Great. We are live, Alexander. You can hear me, you can see me. How are you doing, Alexander?
I can hear you and see you very well, and I'm delighted again to be on our show. And we've got a very interesting discussion topic to talk about. And can I say, this is a slightly cold winter day in London, well, autumn day in London. So, of course, I'm drinking hot chocolate with a bit of ginger in it just to keep myself warm in preparation for the colder days, which apparently are to come.
Yeah, winter is coming, and we've got no energy.
We've got no energy.
What are we to do? That evil Putin, Alexander. He this is all part of his master plan, I guess, isn't it? I mean, at first he raised and groomed Donald Trump to be president of the United States. And now he's holding back the energy from the European Union. What a diabolical plan!
Absolutely, and of course he's also made sure that we're going to have a cold winter coming ahead, and we had a cold winter last year. So
he controls the weather, though.
He controls the weather. He controls the weather. So you see, I mean, he's obviously got his sinister tentacles in every place, and he's now moving forward with his evil master plan. Well, I'm not quite sure what precisely, but anyway, no doubt he has some evil master plan.
Evil President Putin, as Joe Biden refers to him. Well, Alexander, natural gas and energy. It's he has, from what I've heard, in the Kremlin, he has like a spigot, like a little lever, and he can just kind of turn on and off the gas that goes into Europe. Like he just sits there and just cranks it up or cranks it down, depending on how he feels. So, I mean, it's, he's got everything pretty much at his fingertips as far as the energy that's going in and out of Europe. And I hear Nord Stream 2, it's going to be the same kind of system where he'll just have, a little lever and he'll just crank it up or down.
Absolutely. I mean,
he may even have an app on his iPad where he just kind of,
Probably. I'm sure that's exactly what he does. After all, he's the sort of, figure, or, James Bond villain writ large. He's able to do all of these things, and he could just turn on the gas and turn it off with effortless ease, and change things immediately and totally. But talking in all seriousness,
let's hold that thought, Alexander.
Okay,
hold that thought, because I just want to say I just want to welcome everybody to the live stream. I want to say hello to our moderators as well, who are helping us out on this live stream. Cosmic Rain, GEC, Alan Watson. They have got the blue wrench, and they are helping us out. Thank you very much, guys, for helping us out. Hit that like, everybody, on your way in. It really helps get this video out there. Real simple. Just tap that like button ever so lightly, ever so gently, and you will get this video out to more people. And Alexander, I just want to give a quick plug to a video that you did on Locals. It was exclusive to Locals. Everyone jump on Locals. You'll see all kinds of great short video content that Alexander is putting up. And it was actually on this topic, Alexander, where you discuss the energy crisis and the blame being put on Russia and on Vladimir Putin. So, Alexander, I cut you off right when you were about to get serious about all of this. So let's get serious and let's talk energy. Let's talk the blame being put on Russia for what is going to be a cold winter and an energy crisis. What is really going on here?
Well, what we have is an accumulation of mistakes going back decades in Europe, with European energy policy especially, driven by political and ideological considerations instead of economic ones. And they've now all come together in a crisis this winter, because we've done all kinds of strange things to our energy mix in Europe. And at the same time, we've managed to mismanage completely our relationship with Russia. Briefly, we don't like coal, so we've tried to scale down our use of coal. We haven't done that entirely successfully, but that's what we've been working towards. So we've tried to scale down coal because we don't like fossil fuels. We've also gone ahead and we've stopped importing oil. We don't have oil-powered power stations in the way that we did, for example, in the 60s and 70s, because, well, we can't depend on Arab suppliers, and that's also a fossil fuel. We don't like nuclear power because, of course, the Greens are object very strongly to nuclear power. They're convinced that nuclear power is dangerous in all kinds of ways. It's never been clear to me in what way it's more dangerous than any other industrial process, but they insist that it's dangerous. So we don't have nuclear power either. We built lots of windmills across Northern Europe, and those do provide a certain amount of power, quite a lot actually. But of course, they're very dependent on the weather, because without wind, windmills by definition can't turn. So we don't have very much electricity storage facilities, because, as we all know, batteries have not yet evolved to anything like the level where we can store electricity in that kind of way. And we had a very cold winter last year, a very long winter last year, which meant that we had to use up a lot of the gas which was in our reserves, and then that got depleted, and then we had to continue to use gas through the summer because there wasn't very much wind, which depleted our reserves even more. And because we don't like the Russians, we haven't sorted out good long-term contracts for gas with them either. We've been buying gas on the speculators market, where it goes up and down, and we pay spot prices, because we've always assumed, and our British friends have told us, that that's the best way to go, because that's the cheapest way you can get gas. But of course, the spot market has now gone berserk, because energy prices around the world are rising, and the Asians have been outbidding us with higher prices for gas on the spot market, so that all the liquefied natural gas that's available is going to Asia instead. So we find ourselves in a very difficult position in Europe. And what do we do when we are in those sort of positions? Well, we don't, of course, accept that we're to fault in any way. We have to find someone to blame, and that person who has to be blamed is Mr. Putin, who is deliberately engineering and orchestrating some kind of energy crisis in Europe in order to achieve, well, I'm not quite sure what exactly he's supposed to be seeking to achieve by creating an energy crisis in Europe. You come across all kinds of theories and suggestions. Some say that he wants to get Nord Stream 2 licensed, but Nord Stream 2 is going to be licensed anyway. We are hearing that it's all about the third energy package, but the Russians have all kinds of alternative means to deal with that also. None of these suggestions or proposals make any sense. And it all boils down, in the end, to bad decisions made over 30 years, accumulating and now reaching that point of crisis where, we now find ourselves in the situation in which we are in. And note, by the way, and I'm sure it's not a coincidence, that there's just been an edict from our friends and masters and supervisors in YouTube that we're not allowed any longer to discuss a certain topic. And of course, if you think that we're not allowed to discuss that topic because, well, this is just coincidence that we're also having all these problems in Europe at this time, that this is just a coincidence, well, I have a bridge to sell you.
Yeah, you're not allowed. Well, going forward, you won't be able to do shows on climate change. The videos won't get taken down, but they will be demonetized. But that's just the first step. We've seen this play out before. They'll start with the demonetization, and then they'll just start with a purge and an outright cancellation of channels that decide to talk about climate change, or at least talk about climate change in a way that they don't find it appropriate, that doesn't fit the orthodoxy. Of climate change. It goes back to what I've said, Alexander. They're canceling so much speech that in about 5 years we're just going to be grunting our live streams. That's pretty much where we're heading. But it's crazy. Why Russia, Alexander? Why do they blame Russia for all of this? And is this also in line with the expulsion of the 10 diplomats from NATO and this newest and latest quote unquote spy scandal that has also occurred? I mean, what's really going on here?
Well, of course,
are they just covering their asses, or
all right, okay. I mean, but first of all, let's just deal with that spy scandal. I mean, I've no doubt the timing there is intentional. I mean, clearly there is a problem. You know, that they want to get rid of all the. You know, they're saying these people are spies. Once upon a time, if you expelled spies, you did it privately. You told the government, look, we found that these people are doing things that they shouldn't be doing, but we're going to ask them to, can you please take them away privately? And the government would comply, and it would all be done quietly behind the scenes, because after all, people do spy on each other. I'm not saying, by the way, that these people were spies. I'm saying if they were spies, that is the way it used to be done. Now we make a melodrama out of it, because, of course, we're not really interested in dealing with spy issues. We're more interested, again, in constructing this narrative of the bad Russians doing all these bad things. And the result is we have this incident, which, of course, happens exactly now. And this has happened simultaneously as we've had a very aggressively worded letter sent by the United States and 43 other states, all of them predominantly European NATO states, to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, making all kinds of demands and threats about Russia over the Navalny's alleged poisoning, that particular incident, and demanding answers, as they put it, about Russia's Novichok program. So we have that happening as well. And we have Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor of the United States. He's just come out of a difficult meeting with China's Yang Jiechi, and he comes along and he says that Russia mustn't use gas as a weapon to coerce the Europeans and to force them into making concessions. And so all of this is concerted, and it's partly, as I said, people diverting the debate away from themselves, not acknowledging that there's been mistakes, profound, long-standing mistakes in European energy policy that go back decades. So you find someone to blame. But it's also, I think, partly the geopolitical narrative that we have, which is, of course, that we blame the Russians for everything because the Russians stand in our way over so many matters, in Ukraine, in Syria, in relations with China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, in the way they run their economy, in all of those sort of things. So we are very, very critical of Russia all the time. We're constantly putting pressure on them and stigmatizing them and abusing them in every conceivable way we can. And of course, and this needs also to be said, this does tap in to a very powerful prejudice that exists in many European countries against Russia. I mean, the fact has to be faced. There are an awful lot of people in Europe who don't like Russia for all sorts of reasons, sometimes valid reasons, if you're talking about countries in Eastern Europe, sometimes completely crazy reasons or no good reasons at all, as in Britain, where we've never really had a problem with Russia, at least not since the mid-19th century, when in fact it was we who invaded the country. So, I mean, we have all of these issues that come together. So on the one hand, we blame the Russians because we don't want to admit to our mistakes. On the other hand, we blame the Russians because we have a geopolitical beef with them. And on the third level, we blame the Russians because we don't like them anyway. And all of that comes together, and that is what creates this narrative.
All right. So Putin came out with a statement the other day, and he explained how delivering the natural gas is not as simple as we were joking around in the beginning of this live stream. Not as simple as just turning, a lever on and off. These are things where you're either signing long-term contracts or spot contracts, and you have to get the pricing down, you have to get the supply down, and then the gas gets delivered.
Yeah.
He explained that Europe just did not do that. Where you look at
Yeah.
Asia and other countries, they've inked long-term deals, so they're fine. Explain that a little bit, Alexander, what's
Well,
going on? Because the media paints this picture, as we were joking in the beginning of this live stream, that it's just Putin sitting there, just kind of saying a little more gas, no, less gas, a little more gas, less gas. And it doesn't work like that.
I absolutely not. And I'm going to actually quote Putin's own words. And this is what he said. And it's fascinating that nobody in the Western media is reporting these words. One of our community on locals did, but you have to go to the Kremlin website to see the entire transcript. But the words that he used in the very long discussion, very interesting discussion, were the following. Trading in gas is not like trading in watches, underpants, or ties, or cars. It is not even like oil, which can be produced and stored anywhere, including in tankers, waiting for the market situation to clear up. Gas is different, since it cannot be stored this way. Even liquefied natural gas has to be produced, liquefied, loaded on into tankers, delivered, and then converted back into gaseous state. This is a costly and complex process. It does not work like that. We are seeing today, what we're seeing today is the result of persistent, or to put it bluntly, careless actions, to say the least, with direct consequences on the market. So what he's basically saying is gas is not something you can just extract easily. Extracting gas is difficult. It's challenging. Also, storing gas is challenging because gas is, by definition, a gas. It has to be stored in special ways. Liquefied natural gas has to be stored in special ways. You can't just keep large amounts waiting in store around the world like you can with oil, waiting for the market to go up and down and then simply releasing it onto the market. It doesn't work like that because, by definition, a gas needs vastly greater storage spaces than a liquid like oil does. Even liquefied natural gas needs particular processes which oil does not. So you can't do that. What you need to do is to have long-term gas supply contracts which will provide you with a stable gas supply over the year round, and which you can then adjust as the case is needed. But of course, the Europeans didn't do that. They treated gas like it was oil. And just as people buy oil on the spot market as oil prices go up and down, they try to do the same with gas. And what they found is that in trying to do that, they've ended up without enough reserves of gas to get them through the winter and facing a gas supply crunch. And I mean, that is the problem. And Russia can't just turn a toggle and switch on the gas, because again, as gas is a gaseous substance and as storage of it is so much more challenging, the best way to store gas is to leave it underground. You can only pump it out when the demand for it is there. And if the demand suddenly comes on, you can't just turn on the tap and start producing it in vast quantities and sending it downstream to your suppliers suddenly to meet a demand surge. It doesn't work like that. Now, in terms of the latest problem, Russia also had a cold winter. Russia also needed to replenish its gas reserves for the winter which is to come. It needed, therefore, to use a lot of its gas for its own use. It also has now a big new customer, which is China, and it needed to supply gas to China. And that meant that because the Europeans hadn't made those arrangements for long-term gas supply contracts, the gas wasn't being pumped in the necessary quantities over the spring, summer, and early autumn to meet the necessary supply demands in Europe for the winter. And that's why we have the crisis that we have. He goes on to say, by the way, in the same comments, that he went once to Brussels and tried to explain all of this to the Europeans, and the Europeans reacted with complete arrogance and snobbery. He uses that, that the response he got was snobbish, and that he just wasn't able to get through to them. Here we go. I remember the discussions within the European Commission, and I have been to Brussels myself. I do not remember, but I think that you were there too. That's talking to the so-called experts was not easy, since they tend to take a somewhat snobbish attitude and believe that their opinion is the only right one and do not want to hear anything else. I hope that this time something will change. Well, of course, we know nothing will change. But anyway, that's the problem. He's tried to get them to understand that there are problems, that the gas market operates in a different way to the oil market. And they just weren't listening because, of course, from their point of view, they're not people. The people who make the decisions in Brussels and elsewhere are not technical people. They're not people who are really familiar with the industry. They are people who are ideologues and politicians and who think about everything in those sort of terms.
And dummies.
And dummies as well. Well, I mean, they're dummies. They're dummies because they don't listen to experts.
Yeah.
Or rather, they don't listen to experts who tell them the truth. They listen to so-called experts who tell them what they want to hear.
There's probably a million experts that know exactly how the gas market works.
Absolutely, of course there are.
Yeah, the natural gas. Of course there are.
But they're not going to get a hearing in Brussels or in the European Parliament or anything like that.
And if the EU really wanted to safeguard its energy supplies and its gas supplies, it just would have inked long-term contracts. But they weren't allowed to do so.
No,
they weren't allowed to do so because of politics and ideology. Alexander, talk about Hungary and the fact that Hungary has entered deals with Russia. That's huge. And then also talk about the fact that on the one hand, they're asking Russia to build Nord Stream 2. They complete Germany, specifically, they complete Nord Stream 2 for the purpose of getting more energy to Europe.
Yeah.
And then they start expelling Russian diplomats and demonizing Russia. Yeah. I mean, you can't have the best of both worlds. You can't go to Russia on the one hand and say, give us more gas, give us more gas. And on the other hand, say, you know what? Let's try to stop Nord Stream 2. Let's try to stop more gas coming in and let's expel your diplomats. I mean, nothing makes any sense. There's no consistency in their policy whatsoever.
No, I mean, it's absolutely inconsistent, and it just changes from one day to the next, depending on who is in the ascendant at any one particular point in time. Let's talk about Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 was a German idea. The Germans decided in 2015 to close down all their nuclear power stations because they were spooked by the accident in Fukushima in Japan, and the Greens were a rising force in Germany, and Merkel, who was the chancellor, as she always does, whenever she found herself in that kind of challenge, she tilted towards the Greens, so she acceded to Green demands to close down all the nuclear power stations. So that created a major energy shortage in Germany. It also, by the way, made the Germans more dependent on coal, which meant that they couldn't meet their carbon targets. And as Putin also pointed out in this very same debate that I'm talking about, Germany's energy mix depends, 27% of it depends on coal. Russia's, by the way, is only 13% on coal, yet the Germans preach to the Russians about carbon and all of these things, even though, in fact, they use more coal than the Russians do. But anyway, put that aside. So the Germans come along. They have these commitments, these carbon commitments. They're not going to use nuclear power. What do? They need more natural gas because natural gas has a much smaller carbon footprint than oil and orders of magnitude less than coal. So they come along to Russia. They say, well, look, we've sanctioned you, we've demonized you, we've said all sorts of horrid things about you, we've tried to impose the third energy package on you, but we need gas from you to meet our carbon commitments, secure our energy future. So please, please give us a pipeline. And the Russians weren't entirely convinced, But after all, they were assured that there would not be any political or legal problems. And with a great deal of reluctance, as I very well remember, they were persuaded to agree to it. And they did agree to it. And of course, they built the pipeline, and the pipeline has taken far longer than anybody expected that it would to complete, because the Europeans turned out to be far from united, and there was endless harassment about the pipeline and endless media campaigns against it and American sanctions and you name it, all to prevent this pipeline being built. And the pipeline is built, and it's now ready, and it's filling up with gas. But you can't actually supply the gas through the pipeline, because having built the pipeline, having got the Russians to build the pipeline, you now try and bog it down in license agreements, because you're trying again to get the Russians to agree to your third energy package. The third energy package being the package whereby European companies would go into Russia and develop Russian gas fields like Russia was Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or someplace like that. In other words, give over control of the Russian gas industry to European companies, something the Russians will never agree to and have always said they won't agree to. So that pipeline at the moment isn't working, even though it can. And the point to understand about Nord Stream 2, we talked about the way in which Russia can't switch on gas on and off as it chooses. The Nord Stream 2 has, in effect, shaped the development of Russian gas fields, because the historic Russian gas fields in Western Ukraine and in Western Russia and in Siberia, which used to be the main fields, the gas fields that used to supply Europe, they were developed in the 1960s and they're becoming depleted. And the gas pipelines that went through Ukraine linked up to them, and they're becoming increasingly decrepit. So because the Russians were building Nord Stream 2, and because they were developing the new gas fields in the north, in the Arctic, where there is, by the way, enormous amounts of gas to be had, it made sense to link Nord Stream 2 with these gas fields. So if Nord Stream 2 were able to start to work, it would be able to supply gas directly from those Arctic gas fields, the new ones, to Europe more quickly than would be the case if you send them all the way around Ukraine and did all those complicated things. But of course, you're not doing that. You're not allowing Nord Stream 2 to work, even in the middle of a gas crisis in Europe. You are bogging it down in court cases, licensing disputes, and all the rest. So it's stop, go. On the one hand, you say you want it. On the other hand, you say you don't. You create confusion and chaos within your own energy market and your own energy industry. And what you are simultaneously doing is you see some countries, Hungary being, of course, the most important example, but also Serbia, which is, of course, not in the EU, but, is a European country, to some extent Austria too. They're starting to make their own decisions. And they're starting to say, look, we can't go on with this.
Big news.
We can't have the Europeans with all their issues and all their bitter issues getting us into this kind of mess. We have our responsibilities to our own consumers, to our own businesses, to our own industries, and they're now starting to cut their own deals with the Russians. And we've seen Orban, Hungary, do its deal to get gas from Russia, from Gazprom directly via Turk Stream and the various spurs that are being built. That's the southern pipeline that's passing through Turkey. And we've had a fascinating article by none other than the president of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, in The Guardian, pointing out that he's done exactly the same thing. And Serbia is not facing these problems this winter. It has all the gas that it needs to get through the winter, because it did these long-term deals with Gazprom, the very deals that the Europeans refused to make. So that's good. That's big. And I predict that if this chaos and muddle continues for much longer, you're going to see more and more central European states, the ones that are most directly affected, and potentially other countries like Italy and Greece, for example, starting to cut their own deals with Gazprom as well. And of course, at that point, we could start to see the entire structure of EU energy policy begin to disintegrate. So I think the Hungarian move is a big one, and it might actually set an example which others might follow.
That's why they're demonizing Hungary so much, because they know that this deal that Orban struck with Gazprom, it goes against, once again, it goes against the EU solidarity, the orthodoxy of the EU. We make one decision central from Brussels, and everyone, no matter what, has to follow that decision, no matter how stupid and dumb that decision is. Every member nation has to follow it. Exactly. And in Orban's case, the only member states that are going to follow Brussels' decision are the dumb ones. Orban, being the smart one, says, you know what? You guys are a bunch of fools. You can't figure out your energy policy at all. Build Nord Stream, but bog it down. Put licensing now restrictions on Nord Stream. We need energy. We're going to freeze. But you know what? We're going to demonize Russia and we're going to piss them off. Orban said, you know what? You guys are like children. I'm just going to go straight to the source. I'm going to cut my deal man to man, business in a business-like manner. And I'm going to make sure that my people do not freeze and do not pay a lot of money this winter for energy. That's right there. That's right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Russian-European energy partnership is it's obvious. You only, as I said, you only have to look at the geography. A good relationship was there to be had. It took a particular genius for the Europeans to mess it up to the extent that they have. But they've done that because they're obsessed with geopolitical, ideological goals, which they then impose on everyone else. They've tried to impose it on the Russians via the third energy package. And of course, that didn't get anywhere. And they've tried to enforce it on EU member states. And some EU member states, Bulgaria, for example, acceded to European energy demands back in 2014. As I very well remember, there was going to be the South Stream pipeline that was going to be built through the Black Sea, and it was going to go to Bulgaria and pass through Greece and pass through the Balkans. And it would have been a major benefit for these countries. But of course, they did what the Europeans told them. They went along with the third energy package. And the result was, of course, that the Russians pulled out and they diverted the gas to Turkey instead. And they were left high and dry. And now they're going to be cold, or at least they could be cold in the winter. So it's stupid. And ultimately, it shows how utterly self-defeating this whole thing is. But it is exactly what one expects from the EU combine. It is centralized, it is disorganized, it is incompetent, and it is viscerally hostile to Russia, because Russia stands in the way of their geopolitical and ideological objectives. So that creates the perfect storm, which is the one we're seeing this winter.
Centralized stupidity, Alexander. It's not, let's diverge a little bit, but it is connected to what you were saying. And we have to talk about the news that came in, I believe today, this morning, or maybe last night, about Poland's announcement that they're not going to go along with these legal restrictions, that these legal regulations and control that the EU wanted to impose on them. This was a huge shock. This shocked me, actually, because I thought Poland was going to fold and they were going to say, you know what, EU, come in, run our courts, dictate to us our legal framework, and that was going to be that. And then you were going to see the entire European Union run the entire legal framework of every member state. I believe that was the EU's goal. They were looking to say, you know what, once we get our clause into Poland's legal system, then we're just going to control every single member state's legal framework. But Poland came out with the announcement and they said, no chance.
That's
No way.
exactly.
We're going to control our own legal system. EU, Brussels, buzz off.
Absolutely. I mean, this has been shaping up into a major battle, legal battle for some time. And the polls at one point looked like they were going to fold because they were carrying out various reorganizations to their constitutional court. As I've said before in previous programs, you might agree with that, you might disagree with that, but that is entirely the legal or sovereign prerogative of any country to structure its courts as it chooses to do. But that was unacceptable to the EU. They said, you can't make these changes to the organization of the Polish Constitutional Court. And the Poles folded. They agreed that they wouldn't carry out these reorganizations in the way that the EU, as the EU demanded that they shouldn't do. And now, however, we've seen that very same Constitutional Court come out with this decision, which says that the Polish constitution overrides EU law. Now, that is an existential challenge for the EU, because if a member state says that EU law is subject to the national law of the sovereign state, then, of course, the entire EU system is in jeopardy, because the only way the EU can work as a centralized combine is by getting every member state to apply and enforce its laws. If member states say, well, look, we're only going to enforce those laws which are consistent with our constitution and our legal system, then, of course, the EU, as it exists today, as a centralized bloc, which ultimately aspires to be a super state, it can't function. If you go back in time to the Soviet Union, by the way, that was how the Soviet Union ended, when the various constituent republics of the Soviet Union started to come forward and say that from then on, from about 1988-89, the laws of the individual republics were superior to Soviet law. And that set the process whereby the chain reaction, if you like, which caused the Soviet Union to collapse. And if you get to that same position with the EU, and the EU is a more fragile entity than the Soviet Union was, well, then it too will collapse as well. So the Europeans are not going to accept this decision. They're now going to redouble and treble and quadruple their pressure on Poland to get Poland to fall back into line. The Polish government is not a strong, it's a very polarized country. And we're now going to see enormous pressures piling up on Poland over the next few months and years. And, well, it might even take years. We'll see how strong the Poles are in sticking to this decision. But bear in mind, this is a constitutional court decision, and it might not be easy to reverse. And you're absolutely right. It is intimately related to this crisis over energy policy, because even though the two are not, the judges who made this decision were thinking about energy, it all comes down to the same underlying problem, that you have an out of touch, unaccountable, unelected group of people in Brussels imposing their ideas on everyone else, and be it on energy policy or any other type of policy that you can think of. These decisions that they are imposing are often not the appropriate or wise ones, and they often don't reflect the sentiments or the needs of the people of the countries that they're being imposed upon. And that's why you're now starting to get pushback.
Okay, so Poland has said we're not going to abide by your legal regulations. Mm-hmm. They've said we're going to do our own thing. Hungary's doing their own thing, and they're inking their own energy deals. Romania, for example, tried to move away from the mandates, the jab mandates that the EU was imposing, but they actually folded back into line. Yeah. Their government collapsed. They say their government collapsed for other reasons. I believe the mandates were a strong reason why. You're starting to see a lot of cracks forming You're starting to see governments starting to debate, to really have a problem with, do we start to push back against Brussels and look for sovereignty, or do we just follow the Brussels dictate? Am I making too much of this, Alexander? Are these cracks really starting to form, or does the EU have control of the situation? We have elections in France coming up as well. We've gone in depth on Italy. I'm just trying to figure out if we're being too optimistic in saying that countries are acting up, or are things starting to crumble? Maybe at a slower pace, but are things starting to crumble? We also have corruption stuff starting to take place against the government in Austria as well, via the Greens. They're saying that the government in Austria is corrupt, and they're trying to make that government fall. A lot of stuff is going on here. Where do you see this heading?
Yes, I mean, the thing with the Greens in Austria and the use of corruption, I mean, bear in mind, the Greens are always the most ardent pro-EU party in any country now. And I am sure that the corruption scandal in Austria is partly targeting a government in Austria, which is seen as unreliable. And this has been true for a long time. And we've seen previous scandals like that in Austria. Austria has good relations with Russia, has an independent policy on many things. So it's been targeted in exactly the same way as Hungary has been targeted, in exactly the same way as Poland is going to be targeted, in exactly the way the recent Romanian government found itself under pressure. All of those sorts of things are part of that. It could be that we're going to see the fractures grow. I mean, wherever you look, you see problems. You see them in Spain, for example. I mean, we did programs recently about elections in Spain and how the anti-EU right seems to be rising in Spain. We've done many problems about Italy too. One can never say for sure until it finally comes that the whole thing is crumbling and that the cracks are becoming impossible to control, because the EU has shown a genius in managing to coerce and bully and pressure everybody to come into line, and they might be able to do it again. But there is one important difference, and there's one thing that has changed, and that might make all the difference. Mrs. Europe, Queen Merkel, is going. Now, Merkel had a particular genius in getting everything together. She whatever, I want to make it very clear when I talk about genius, I mean, not that I approve of Merkel at all. Everybody who knows me knows that I've never I can abide Merkel. But I have to acknowledge her very particular set of political skills. She had a solid political base in Germany. The CDU, CSU looked like the solid government party in Germany. She had a solid base in Germany, and she always had the skill of building together a majority within the EU Council and embarrassing and marginalizing, isolating the sort of dissidents and getting them to fall into line. It's very difficult to see anyone who has her particular set of skills taking over. I mean, Macron, who is now positioning himself to become the Napoleon of Europe, is a deeply polarizing figure. And he doesn't have those diplomatic skills. On the contrary, he's more likely to put people's backs up, to increase opposition, to increase resistance, to cause the cracks in Europe to grow. So Macron is not an alternative. And the new German government, when it is formed, and that could take months, is likely to be much weaker and more fragile than the German governments that Merkel led, because it will be a three-party coalition with the various three parties very much in conflict with each other on fundamental issues. So without Merkel, it may be much more difficult to keep the show on the road than it's been up to now. So that's not something to be overlooked. Merkel, a little like, I always compare her with the Habsburg Chancellor, Prince Metternich, who basically ran Europe in a very similar style in the early 19th century. When Metternich fell, the whole structure that he embodied collapsed around him. With Merkel gone, perhaps the same will happen with the structure that she's created in Europe now. We shall just have to see. I think the cracks are certainly there. They're certainly growing. Over time, they will get worse, but it may be that with her gone, they will get worse much faster. And can I say something? Yes, I agree. Initially, the cracks will appear to be small. They always do. But with a structure like the European Union, when the cracks start to get wider, what you will see is the disintegration happen very fast. Because at that point, as people begin to lose belief in the system and fear of the system, everybody will rush to make their own decisions, and the whole thing will break down.
Yeah. Valies is also in the house moderating as well. I just saw you, Valies. Thank you very much for moderating. Alexander, the energy situation in the UK, do they have a handle on things, or what's going on?
No, they don't have a handle on things because they've made many of the same mistakes that the EU has had. Well, of course, they were part of the EU for a long time. And by the way, Putin criticized Britain in these comments. He said that many of the mistakes that the EU has made in terms of energy policy, in particular, its decision to move away from long-term contracts to short-term spot pricing contracts, contracts on the spot market, were all done on the advice of so-called British experts. Anyway, that's what Putin said. But what we have in Britain is a very fragmented energy industry. I mean, it's all basically broken up into small segments with lots of companies that are very unstable. We don't even have the level of reserves in terms of natural gas that many of the European countries do. So we are very short of gas. We've also done many of the same things that other countries have done, like the United States, for example. We've hollowed out, as it turns out, many parts of our industries. So one of the things that we did, we hollowed out the transportation system. So Britain used to have, as I very well remember, a very well organized long haulage driver system. I mean, and there were skilled drivers, well paid, highly unionized, by the way, and there was all kinds of systems. There were good rest stops. There were good places for them to stop on motorways. All that was very well organized indeed. Well, what we did, and this really started in the 1990s through the Blair period, was that we allowed all that to basically end. Instead of paying highly skilled, well-paid British drivers, we imported drivers from Eastern Europe because they could come, through the EU freedom of movement provisions. They were paid far less. Of course, they weren't unionized, and all the systems that were there to provide for them, the rest stops, the motels, the food places, all of that gradually withered away. And what has now happened is that, of course, we've left the EU. The government is determined not to allow immigrant labor to come in and replace British labor in the way that used to happen. But we have this problem in that we don't have that cadre of British drivers anymore. So that's created other problems in terms of road haulage, and that's added to the supply problems within Britain. It needs to be stressed, by the way, this is a problem within Britain. If we had those long haulage drivers, we would be able to sort out this problem. Now, there are things that can be done. There are probably things that can be done quickly to resolve these problems, and I suspect they will be done quickly. But what it highlights is the way in which Brexit does point Britain in certain directions, and it also shows, Britain needs to start to reorganize its economy in a way that isn't dependent in the same way that it used to be on low-wage immigrant labor. But it also shows the extent to which that connection with the EU has led to large sectors of the British economy being hollowed out, which is, of course, very like what happened with the United States and the way its economy, much of its industrial base, got hollowed out as a result of globalization. So, you know, these things will take a long time to sort out. And we have many problems wait over the winter. And, you know, I come back to what I've said many times. Johnson is not a particularly good manager. And one does wonder whether he's the right person to manage these problems and to work a way through. It needs somebody able to work 15 hours a day, you know, meet all the right people, sort out the problems, crisis manage. And that's not what Boris does. That's not the kind of style of politician that he is.
Neither is Sunak, though, from listening to you talk about this. Yeah,
nobody in the British government is. I mean, that's the other thing, because we've become so much part of the globalized system. The kind of technocrat base of very capable technocrat ministers that you could always find in Britain, from both parties, by the way, both the Conservative and Labour parties always had a phalanx of capable technocrats, engineers, lawyers, people who'd worked on shop floors and who'd risen through unions, managers, those kind of people. They just don't exist in politics anymore. If you look at the kind of people who are there in politics today in Britain, they are people who are professional politicians. They went into politics straight after leaving university. They've never managed anything or done any kind of work in industry or business of any kind. And they're completely at sea in dealing with these kind of problems.
All right, Alexander, you mentioned globalism. And I'm going to read you a headline from Zero Hedge. Ireland agrees to minimum global corporate tax deal, leaving Hungary, Estonia as EU's last holdouts. The 15% tax deal, the 15% global corporate tax structure that the Biden White House is trying to push out. Ireland has apparently agreed to it. There's a lot of caveats in there. What are your first impressions of this? Once again, Hungary, Estonia, those are the only two countries in the EU that are left out of this global tax structure.
I fully expected it to happen because, of course, Ireland is, of course, a country which has certain connections to Biden. And, of course, I am sure that the fact that, you know, Biden has been supporting Ireland against Britain over the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, has not come without a price. So I was sure that Ireland would crumble. And Estonia, will it be able to withstand all this? Doubt it. That, of course, leaves Viktor Orban again. And why is this happening? Well, for two reasons. One, because, of course, Biden and co want to see a globalized tax system because, well, let's say it straightforwardly, they're globalists. That's very much what they want. They don't want to see each country running its own tax system independently of the other, because that wouldn't do. That might give some countries ideas that, you know, their taxes belong to themselves and that they can run their own fiscal policies without, being accountable to the high priests of globalism anymore. And at the same time, and we've got to be very straightforward about this, it's because of the tax changes that Biden wants to carry out in the we may talk about Biden, the administration wants to carry out within the United States itself. And the administration doesn't want people relocating elsewhere to evade those taxes. So it's all done partly, you know, to promote globalization, partly in order to suit the political needs of the Democratic Party in the United States. And we see that they've been able to twist arms in Europe, and of course, all the European states will fall into line. Whether Orban will continue to resist this, we shall see.
I mean, I am taking a simplistic view of things because, like I said, there are going to be a lot of caveats and there'll be a lot of loopholes. Yeah. But the basic premise is, why would a company relocate it, a large company in this case, why would they relocate to Ireland if, you have the 15% tax all around the world. I mean, it seems like Ireland is kind of just giving up one of its competitive advantages, of which you've had many companies locate to Ireland because of the tax structure. It's kind of like they're saying, you know what, we're giving that up. Once again, I know there's going to be a lot of caveats and a lot of loopholes that will be afforded, but taking it even further, the big corporations, yeah, they'll be able to strike deals with the Irish government and to find those loopholes and to find those caveats. But eventually this is going to move from big corporations to medium-sized corporations to small corporations and to eventually the everyday citizen, to the personal level. I mean, this is where this is all going to head. And I know the Irish government came out with statements just the other day, and they said, no, this is just for very, very large corporations. We're not going to touch corporations with this much revenue or these many employees. You know, that's BS. You know, it's just a matter of time before this Biden 15% tax is just going to cover every single corporation, whether you're Amazon or the corner coffee shop.
Yeah.
Why would a country give up this competitive advantage? And that's what they're doing. They're giving it up. And what incentives does a company now have to say, yeah, let's go to Ireland. Let's move our workforce to Ireland. Let's employ people in Ireland because they give us X, Y, and Z benefits for being there. That's gone.
Well, I mean, it is economically suicidal because it is completely contrary to the particular economic model that Ireland has developed over the last 40, 50 years. The whole point about Ireland, the basis of, making Ireland, and the Irish tiger, as it was called, was that it had a low tax regime. And now that's all been lost in order to appease and satisfy the political needs of the Democrats in the United States. But why did Ireland do this? Why did it make this, absurd decision, which is economically suicidal? Well, the straightforward answer is we come back to the point that we made earlier in the program. The people who run things nowadays in Dublin, in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, these are not people who understand economics very well. They're not really part of that world. They are not personally directly affected by these decisions. They are going along with what they're told to do because they don't want to get on the bad side of the Democrats in the United States. They don't want to get on the bad side of the people in Brussels who support these changes. They don't want to get on the bad side of the people in Washington who support these changes. So it's easier for them to sacrifice Ireland's economic future than to hold out and fight against it and to say no. They find it very difficult to do that because obviously if they do that, if they do resist, well, they won't be invited to the right parties. They won't, be able to speak with Joe on, first name terms. And of course, more practically, they might find it more difficult to get positions in the various institutions, which are the places where politicians now ultimately always aim to end up.
Yeah, we'll get to super chats in a second, Alexander. Mark my words, if Orbán wins in April, I believe April is the elections. If he wins in April, then you may very well see Hungary exit the EU.
I think it is highly likely. And I'm going to say straightforwardly this. I mean, I think there's, again, a complacent view in many places that Hungary will never risk losing the structural funds. I think the point has now been reached in Hungary's economy and Hungary's economic development, where the advantage Hungary gains from the structural funds is no longer anywhere near as great as it once was, and where Hungary would probably decide, or an Orbán government would probably decide, that its economic future is better outside the EU. Certainly, if the choice is between leaving the EU and adopting the euro, and always understand that that's what the EU wants you to do eventually. They want Hungary, Poland, all of these countries in the end to adopt the euro. Then if your concern is your country's economic future, it ceases to be a choice, because for Hungary and Poland to join the eurozone would be a calamity for those countries.
Yeah. Here's a quick thought before I get to the super chats, Alexander. The EU is always hitting at the UK, right? They're constantly jabbing and hitting at the UK. How come the UK doesn't hit back at the EU? And how come the UK doesn't go to Hungary and say, "Hey, Hungary, come over here. Let's make some deals." Or Russia, let's make some deals to kind of just stick it to the EU, because it always seems like it's coming from one direction, the EU hitting at the UK, and it seems that the UK just sits there and just takes the punches. How come the UK doesn't sit there and say, "You know what? We're gonna start poking at you guys as well, Ursula von der Leyen and Michel and Lagarde."
Well, if you read the British newspapers, at least the pro-Remain British newspapers, you get the opposite impression. They are full of stories about how horrid Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are to the EU, and how the EU is blameless and it's all only reacting to the bad actions that the British government is taking. But ultimately and fundamentally, you're right. It is the British who are on the receiving end, rather and the EU that is pushing them. The reason that is happening is very simple. The EU, or at least the EU leadership, are united. The British are not. There's always within Britain a very, very strong Remainer viewpoint. It's still there within the Conservative Party and government. It's very strong within the business community. You've seen that over the last couple of days, for example, British business has been lobbying very hard for relaxation on visa restrictions so that they can continue to have workers coming in from Europe and taking low paid jobs here. So you have this problem that the British don't speak with a single voice. And dare I say it, if you had Nigel Farage in charge, he might be different. But Boris Johnson, when he's at his best, he can be flamboyant and charming and clever and funny and effective, as he was in the speech he gave at the Conservative Party conference. But a lot of the time, he's not there. He's not very, very capable. He doesn't have that solidity and consistency of purpose and policy, and that ability to work hard through the nights and the days to make it all come together and to unite and to run a strong and united government. So that's the fundamental difference. The EU, incompetent, disorganized, inefficient as it is united. The political class there is united. The Brussels elite are united. The British are not.
Yeah. All right, let's do some super chats. What do you say?
Absolutely.
All right. Let's do it. Magnesia San says, Alexander, I know this is a little off topic, but what is your feeling on the Battle of Delville Forest, World War I?
Oh my goodness! Isn't this in the first? This is the First World War. No?
First World War, yeah.
No, absolutely. My goodness. Well, I am not I should say that I'm not an expert on battle things and things of that kind. So I'm going to definitely have to give a pass on that. That's an obviously enormously interesting topic, a historical topic. If I'm right, and now I'm really going back in time, I think it was the American army fighting the Germans towards the in the last year of the First World War. And my sort of memory of it, and maybe if I'm wrong about this, people will correct me. I think that the Americans suffered a lot of losses during that fighting, and I know that in Britain, at least, there've been some criticisms of the American leadership, and indeed of General Pershing, who was the American commander at that time. And that criticism may be completely unfair. Bear in mind, I'm not a military historian. But what I will say is this, and I don't think that this is something that academic historians would dispute. The entry of the United States into the First World War was an absolute game changer. It was a game changer, not so much because the American army came in, though that was enormously important, but because of the moral and psychological effect that the power of the United States, which is already the rising power at that time, was finally being deployed in this war. And that had a massive effect in Germany. And I have many contacts in Germany and in the Western countries, in France and Britain also. And as a result, in the post-war period, in the interwar years, there was this enormous surge of goodwill to the United States. And you saw it even in little things like the fact that Cartier, for example, the French jeweler, actually created a watch based on the American tank and the tank Américain and things of this kind. So I'm not able to discuss the battle itself because, as I said, I don't remember very much about it, and I'm not a military historian, and I'm not really able to speak about this. But I sort of remember that this rather young American army was roughed up by the Germans, who were, of course, a very experienced army at that time. If that's wrong, I apologize. Perhaps unsurprising for an army that is deployed for the first time. But the overall effect of the United States joining the war, the First World War, cannot be underestimated. And it did make a huge effect on the direction of the war in Europe.
Yeah, I'm looking in the live stream. Adam says, Alex, you're thinking of Belal Wood.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, there you
Okay.
go. Well, there you go. I mean, I accept that. I mean, I'm not a military historian. Talk to me about logistics and that kind of thing, and industrial policies and diplomacy. That I am very, very confident and strong on.
Yeah.
Individual battles, I'm afraid I'm not. The only exception, by the way, the only major exception, believe it or not, is the American Civil War, which I read about when I was at university and found absolutely gripping. And I found that was one of the only war where, the battles and the fighting really engaged me, because I found that so interesting. So I apologize if there's a mistake, but as I said, I'm not going to dig on this because as I said, I don't pretend to be an expert.
Well, here's some more about. Chris Banks says that South African soldiers were heavily involved at the Deville Wood,
Right.
and GSP says the American intervention in World War I was to ensure that the transference of power in Europe not go from Britain to Germany. So.
Well, true. The last point, by the way, is absolutely dead on right. And I'm not getting into it. We can talk about the politics of this. I mean, this should be, I think, another program. But of course, the American intervention in the First World War made a tremendous difference in Europe. But of course, it was deeply controversial in the United States itself, and with very good cause, it's always seemed to me. I mean, Americans were not by any means united in supporting that war, and many of them felt that they were tricked into it. And I think there's a great deal to be said about that. That's a vast topic, a tremendous topic, something we should definitely perhaps do a program about. But I think if we start talking about that, we won't have time to discuss the topic that we flagged up today. So let's definitely come to that one day.
All right. Cosmic Rain says, careful, lads. You may be canceled just for breathing soon. That's maybe where we're heading. Well, they definitely have the masks on us, so that impedes breathing in general. So
certainly.
Good point, Cosmic Rain. Good point. Amrit says, in spite of the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown in Tokyo in 2011 earthquake, Japan still operates nuclear power. What makes Europe reluctant, if there is an example?
Well, good, very, very good point. I mean, Japan goes ahead with nuclear power. Russia goes ahead with nuclear power. They had Chernobyl, of course, that was in Ukraine. But, the Russians have pressed on with nuclear power. They weren't deterred. They were the people who had to deal with these accidents. Well, I think the fundamental difference is that Japan, like Russia, doesn't have a powerful green movement. I mean, green politics are very powerful in Europe indeed. They also have a great deal of influence in the United States itself, where they've, of course, become very central to the left of the Democratic Party. But there's a very powerful green movement in Europe. It's won over a lot of the young people. It's, of course, connected with environmentalism, and it's connected with all sorts of lifestyle issues as well. And must not overlook that. You find a massive overlap between the two. And of course, it has a tremendous effect on the way in which policies are followed. And if we don't have nuclear power in Europe, but they do in Japan, that's the reason for the difference.
Yeah. From Mark Hewitt, never mind the climate change rules forced on the UK one-man truck drivers, but UK tax changes, including the dividend allowance and IR35, have forced these drivers to look elsewhere. Spectacular own goal.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to add to that, just to say I think that's entirely right. It was a spectacular own goal.
Yeah. Mondo is a new member to the Duran community. Welcome, Mondo. And Reach said, it is a Northern European feature to be hostile to powers that are different, like the way they criticized Spain in the 16th century, Russia since the 17th century, and Japan during the 20th century, China today. That feature has been transferred to the USA.
Absolutely right. I mean, again, I agree with that entirely. I mean, it's difficult for people who are not from Northern Europe or who don't know Northern Europe well. And remember, I'm of Greek ethnicity, and I travel a lot in Northern Europe, and I like Northern Europe, by the way. I should make this very clear. I mean, it's very, very wonderfully fine part of the world. But Northern Europeans do have this seemingly invincible belief that they know better than everyone, even when they don't. And it can be extremely grating at times. And given that they also insist always in adding a moralizing element into things, that makes it that can make it absolutely intolerable.
All right. Kevin Dorr says, what the West does with gas is a lot like what we do with hospital workers during a pandemic who refuse to get the jab. Our elites are dummies.
Yeah, our elites are dummies. Absolutely. Yes.
This is everywhere with the firing of nurses and stuff as well, Kevin, even in Greece.
Absolutely.
Even in Greece, they fired 7,000 people. So fired, suspended without pay.
Yeah.
Megawatt, €5 super chat. Thank you very much. And Reach says the EU needs Duran, a 22nd century Japanese robot cat, Japanese cartoon, quite famous in Asia, to give them his gadgets to solve their energy problems.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, that's the other thing, of course. I mean, you look for technological solutions to your problems always, and imagine that there's a technological fix. Well, sometimes there is over time, but you're absolutely right in the implication of your question. There's a great deal of magical thinking around, and the idea that the Russians can simply turn a tap on and off, and that the gas will flow or not as they choose, or as Mr. Putin, in his office in the Kremlin with his white cat on his knee, it's probably plotting his dark schemes, and he's got his lever next to him. Well, that's the way many people think. I've been looking at some bizarre cartoons, by the way, about Putin in the British media at the moment. I mean, there's some very, very weird ones. I mean,
they always start this. They die down for like a month or two, and then they restart it again with Russia and with Putin. Whenever they run into trouble with it, whenever they mismanage something, when I mean they, I mean the European Union or the Biden White House or Trudeau or anybody anybody in this Western structure, whenever they run into trouble, it's blame Putin.
Absolutely.
Period. Their mismanagement, whatever they do, it's Putin's fault. Or they create something where it's where Russia's to blame, like getting rid of 10 NATO diplomats, just stupid stuff like that. And they do it well. It's effective. They get the media on board, and they cover up their mismanagement. The fact that these guys couldn't run a lemonade stand, but they're running countries.
Absolutely correct. I mean, again, you mentioned my program. The video that I did recently, the short video that I did on locals. And one of the major points I made about that was that Putin's words have been completely misrepresented. It gives the impression that Putin promised that there would be extra supplies, flowing towards Europe, which of course works into the narrative that he's actually holding the gas back. And if you actually read his comments, he didn't say anything like that at all. That wasn't the thrust of what he was saying. He was, on the contrary, highlighting the problems which European energy policy has caused. But of course, the narrative has been changed to make it look like Putin made promises which he didn't do, so that when those promises which were never made aren't kept, he'll be blamed for it. And that's how this works. It's actually very cleverly done, and it's almost instinctive.
When did the Putin bashing start? When did Putin become the representation of all their incompetence? When do you think this really started? It was before Trump. Was it during the successful coup in Ukraine, but the failed takeover of Crimea? Was it during the Obama years when Obama would have meetings with Putin and constantly get shellacked by Putin at those meetings, completely embarrassed? Was it Georgia? Was it the war in Georgia, the failed war in Georgia, where Putin came in and wiped out the army in 4 days, pretty much? When did you think this happened, the demonization? Right. Because when Putin moved into office after Yeltsin, I mean, they liked him, or at least that was the impression that we got. Bush was getting along with Putin in the beginning. When did all of this turn?
Well, I actually think that there was already doubts about Putin from the moment that he moved into office. I can remember reading editorials and articles in the British media shortly after Yeltsin appointed him prime minister, which were already very critical of Putin. And there was an extraordinary editorial, this is in 1999, in which The Guardian actually called on Yeltsin to sack him. And the reason at that time was because of Chechnya, because he took a firm line on the jihadi crisis in the Caucasus, sent the Russian army in, and of course they were horrified that he looked like he was going to win, which of course he did in the end. And that already created some anger on the part of the most militant fringe, if you like, of the liberal movement. But I think that the moment it really turns, the moment hostility to Putin crystallized, was in 2003, when he moved against Yukos and he started to bring the oligarchs in Russia into line. That was when when Khodorkovsky got arrested, when it became very clear that Putin was not actually, as many people alleged, the tool of the oligarchs, that he was on the contrary intent on reasserting Russian state authority and making Russia run again as a proper country. And at that moment, as I very well remember, the mood shifted, and those people who had been in the West up to that point willing to work with him, as they put it, but of course willing always to work with him on their own terms, suddenly realized that he was actually serious about restoring Russia as a state, and then they began to become increasingly critical. And then there were further stages, and then there was a speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conference in, I think, 2008 or 2007, where he openly criticized the unipolar policy and globalization. People always forget that a lot of that speech was about globalization. And that, of course, from that moment on, made him a marked man. And that was when the demonization really took off. And it's never abated ever since. In fact, it gets worse with each new iteration.
Yeah, it gets worse and worse. I think right now they just don't even care anymore. I mean, I think it just brushes all of this stuff off.
No. Can I repeat again?
Because there was a time when they did care. But now I think they're not caring too much.
No, the Russians don't. I mean, certainly the Russians don't care. And Putin himself has actually said that he just can't be bothered any longer. But can I just say again, and this is very important to viewers, and that is that never assume that any quote you read from Putin in the media in the West is accurate. Usually, what they do is they don't invent words that he said, that they do sometimes, but they do give them out of context, which gives a completely different impression. What you need to do is go onto his website, where you actually find the official translation the Russian government gives of his words, and you will find that nearly always, in fact almost always now, he says something completely different from what is attributed to him.
Yeah, good point. From Hey Man, Russia, China are looking like Little John and Robin Hood. The sheriff can't be in the second place at once, and its deputies are useless. They've got to be split.
Well, I think that's not a bad comparison. I'm not sure who's Robin and who's Little John or whatever. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, I mean, certainly the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are working together is, I mean, a geostrategic game changer. And by the way, there are reports that the Chinese are, because the Chinese, we haven't talked about China, but of course China has been having electricity outages in northern China, and there have been all sorts of reasons for that also. But there are reports that the Chinese are doing exactly what the Europeans are not doing, which is that they're sending people to Moscow. They're talking about getting coal supplies sent from Russia, that the Russians are going to increase electricity exports to China, and that the Chinese are trying to get more liquefied gas from the Arctic, from the Russian Arctic, sent to them. But of course, the Chinese talk to the Russians instead of abusing them, which by definition, I think is going to achieve an awful lot more.
Yeah, diplomacy instead of demonization. Go figure that would work. Go figure. From Kurt, have a great weekend, Alex and Alexander, and all your cool subscribers. Thank you very much, Kurt, for that. Maria Zabo sends super chat as well. Thank you, Maria. And Bambit Bakanawa sends us a super sticker. Thank you very much, Bambit, for that. Rocky Lux says Gerhard Schroeder is chairman of Nord Stream and Rosneft. Germany guaranteed the loans to build Nord Stream 1 before he left office, and Angela's malaise. Gerhard Schroeder, he was an interesting guy.
He was an interesting man, and he was a much more capable manager than Merkel ever was. I mean, it needs to be said very clearly. I mean, you saw that in, for example, the contrast between the way in which Schroeder handled, floods that hit Germany when he was chancellor, and the way that Merkel did, this summer, with her anointed successor Armin Laschet, called giggling whilst the floods, while they were touring the places where the floods had hit. And, Schroeder, of course, very strongly believed that the future of Germany was in a partnership with Russia. And one of the reasons he's involved in Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 and in Rosneft and all the rest is because he's become a sort of passionate advocate in Germany for that kind of economic partnership. Of course, that means that he gets constantly targeted by parts of the Western media and by Western governments, and he's become in some ways a marginalized figure in the West, and there have been constant insinuations that he's been corrupted in some way and that the Russians are bribing him, even though that has never been proved. So, he's an interesting person. I don't know how much influence he has in Germany anymore, even within his former party, the SPD.
Well, he was good friends with Putin as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They got along well.
That
was the time when, remind me, Alexander, that was Putin, Schroeder, and Chirac, I believe, correct?
Yes, Putin, Schroeder, Chirac, and Berlusconi. People always forget.
And Berlusconi.
But I mean, there was this brief period when Putin was actually friends with the leaders of all the big European countries. And they're all picked off one by one. I mean, Schroeder was replaced by Merkel, and we all know about her. Berlusconi, well, he's vanished from the political scene. And of course, Chirac also had all kinds of legal problems he faced, and he was eventually pushed out. And, well, he was replaced by Sarkozy, Hollande, and Macron, who are very different. So, I mean, it's strange to think back at that time, sort of mid-2000s, when it did look as if for a brief time Russia and some of the big European states would actually find a modus, become friends with each other. And in those days, Putin's friends were in Europe. They were not in China.
Who was Prime Minister of the UK at that time?
Right,
Alexander? Do you remember?
that would have been first. Well, that would have been principally. It was the fag end of the Blair Brown time. I mean, Blair was still prime minister at the time of the Iraq War, obviously, and he came up against the opposition of the French and the Germans, who were at that time led by Schroeder and Chirac. Berlusconi had a different line on Iraq. But then subsequently, Gordon Brown was British Prime Minister, and he was not really involved in politics, foreign policy very much. And then we got David Cameron, who became very anti-Russian.
Yeah. Sidebook VR says, what is Russia's polysocial ideology? No one can say. Think Putin is highly influenced by the late 80s West-East Berlin when he stopped listening to new music. It's an interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. I think Russia has a fully developed ideology. I think it is inching towards finding one. And I think Putin is inching towards finding one. It's a sovereigntist country. It is definitely one that believes that it should be independent, doesn't want to be subordinate to globalist controls. That's absolutely clear cut. They have increasingly emphasized things like the family, and they've gone out of their way to differentiate themselves from the West on these things. They're looking back at their own traditions, and they're very gradually edging back towards a more, shall we say, planned economic system, not, I should stress, Soviet planning, but a system rather like the kind of system you see in South Korea, or you used to see in South Korea and Japan and in France in de Gaulle's time, and things like that, where, you know, the state controls the commanding heights of the economy, has long-term strategic objectives, which it pursues in infrastructure, and the rest provides support to industry and industrial groups, and lets private business do as it pleases and taxes it rather little. That seems to be the way that they're slowly moving towards.
Is Putin a globalist? Is Putin a dictator, Alexander?
He's neither. He is not a globalist, and he's absolutely not a dictator. I mean, people who call Putin a dictator completely misunderstand the country. I mean, he is the undisputed leader of the country, but he is a leader who has to continuously deal with and speak to both his people. That's why he has these mammoth press conferences. He has to show them that he's listening to them, and he has to listen to all the various political forces in Russia. He's been holding a whole series of consultations over the last few days, for example, with the leaders of Russian political parties. He met Zhirinovsky, who was the leader of the Liberal Party, the Nationalist Party in Russia. He's just met with Zyuganov, who is the leader of the Communist Party. He has to talk with them all the time. He absolutely has to continue to show, you know, that he understands Russians, and elections in Russia, by the way, aren't far from being symbolic or token. They're very real exercises, and he has to always keep an eye on what's going to happen in elections. So he's definitely not a dictator, and he's not a globalist either, because of course he and in this he represents the entire mainstream of Russian thinking. He thinks that Russia needs to be sovereign, that it needs to follow its own path, that it can't tie itself into the globalized system, because that would be disastrous. And it would be disastrous in social terms, because they don't agree with the identity issues that we see so prevalent in the West. And there is no constituency in Russia that disagrees with that view. And he also thinks, they also all think it would be disastrous in economic terms. And of course, they experienced that in the 1990s when Russia did integrate itself into the globalized system and experienced an economic and social collapse that Russia was still trying to repair the damage from.
Yeah. Raul says, do you think this discord in the EU will lead to a civil war?
I think it is more likely that it will lead to eventual fragmentation and to various different countries eventually going their own way as the structure breaks down. But I have to say this, that would be such a huge event that unfortunately conflicts within some European states and European societies is not impossible. I mean, one mustn't underestimate the degree of anger that exists in Europe now. I mean, the degree of anger that exists in Britain is off the scale, like I've never known before.
What do you mean? Elaborate there.
Remainers and Leavers are hostile to each other in a way that, for example, Labour and Conservative never used to be. I mean, I remember old Labour and Conservative, and yes, they were opposed to each other. There were class issues and all kinds of things, but it was possible for Labour people and Conservative people on an individual basis to be friends, and they often were. And in politics, you could see, real political friendships, real friendships form across the social and political divide. I'm going to give an example, which some people in the United States may know. People may remember The Avengers, the TV series that came out in the 60s with Emma Peel and John Steed. Well, there was a certain perception in Britain at that time that Steed was a Tory, Conservative, and Emma was Labour. The producers of that program were very concerned about that, by the way, and they gradually tried to adjust that. But it was perfectly acceptable that a Labour and a Conservative person should work together. And they did during the Second World War, for example. Inconceivable today. Remainers and Leavers are now two militantly hostile tribes. It's like, I have to say this, Republicans and Democrats, and left and right in America today. We see conflict in Britain at a scale and at a level I've never known before.
Yeah. Going back to the first super chat, Alexander from Magnesia Shan, it's a follow-up, says, Alexander, the Battle of Deville, World War I, took out the entire South African infantry and cavalry. The general took back one of the standing trees to make a cross. The cross still weeps to this day.
Wow. Okay. So it's a South African battle, not an American one. Well, that makes it even more interesting, actually, because, of course, at that time, we're talking about a period when the Boer War, the war that the British fought against the Afrikaners in Southern Africa, the Afrikaner people in Southern Africa, and which brought Britain into the South Africa and areas of South Africa like the Transvaal and the Orange Free State into the British Empire, and where the British used extraordinary methods to establish control. That, of course, was very recent. So the fact that there was this terrible battle in which South African soldiers were killed in this way, which I didn't know about, I mean, that definitely has its own story and its own poignancy. And I'm pretty sure there are there's a political dimension to it too. But I don't know much about this battle. And I mean, it seems incredibly important and incredibly interesting. And it's certainly one to follow up on.
Yeah. Ralph Steiner says Gallipoli was another British disaster.
Yeah. Everybody in Britain knows about Gallipoli, partly because of Churchill's personal involvement, partly because Britain has always been very close to Australia in ways that it has not always been close to South Africa. Of course, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was the apartheid issues that kept many British people apart from South Africa and made many British people very hostile to the Afrikaner people in South Africa. So Gallipoli is something everybody in Britain knows about. And there's a universal acceptance in Britain that Gallipoli was a debacle. And it was a debacle that the British engineered. The Churchill has a heavy responsibility for, and that the Australians suffered greatly as a result of it. There's a very powerful film about it too, by the way.
It's Mel Gibson, right?
Mel Gibson, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. From Christy, do you think the French fishermen really will follow through on their threats about blockades and the threats of turning off electricity supplies?
I don't know. I don't think it's a bluff. I think that they probably would be willing to follow through. The question is what the man in the Elysee Palace will do, and he's a different factor altogether. Because unless, of course, they have that political support from Paris, then it's difficult to see how this can act out. But Macron is an unpredictable factor, and I still feel at some level that we're going to have a meeting between Johnson and Macron before very long, and the two will iron things out, and we won't see these things take quite the form that we, that all of these things might suggest that we will. But British and French relations are bad, and they're going to continue to get worse, in my opinion. And with Macron as president, it's difficult to see how they can get better.
Yeah, I agree with that. GSP says, you guys are my favorite geopolitical channel. Thank you for your work. Thank you very much, GSP, for that. And Russell says, on the other hand, Fukushima continues to dump radioactive water into the Pacific and will soon expel of massive quantity.
Well, I've heard the same story. I mean, I've absolutely heard the same thing. I mean, I'm not an engineer, or certainly not a nuclear engineer, but I've heard some absolutely appalling things about Fukushima and about how badly managed it was, and that it dumps all kinds of things into the sea and all sorts of things like that. And of course, all these stories, they play out in Europe because, of course, there are lots of people in Europe who talk about Fukushima and dramatize what happened there, and perhaps sometimes over dramatize it, but a lot of what they say no doubt is true. And it has hardened anti-nuclear sentiments in Europe very strongly. My wife was traveling through Germany at the time of the Fukushima accident, and she encountered all sorts of people, Greens at that time, people, she knows lots of people in Germany who are Green, and of course they were extremely agitated about Fukushima, and they remain so still. And I don't know that it necessarily follows that because Fukushima was a bad accident, there would necessarily be bad accidents like that in Europe. I think you could run nuclear power stations more safely. And I also think that people underestimate the extent to which industrial accidents can happen, and how serious industrial accidents can be that are unrelated to nuclear power, and don't always understand that nuclear power accidents can sometimes be just another form of industrial accidents. But perception is what ultimately matters in politics, amongst other things. And the fact of the matter is that nuclear power in Europe is just, it's something that has completely failed because the politics are so hostile to it.
It's the politics. Theodoro, thank you for your super sticker. You also sent the super sticker right when we stopped our last live stream, so I want to thank you for that as well. From Ernesto, good morning from Chile, Masters. I've always missed that you guys talk about South America. Lots of things are happening here under the carpet. Thanks for the show.
We've tried to do programs on South America. Of course, lots of things. Lots of things we need to find out about South America, and the more people who want to talk to us about South America and discuss their own experiences and what's going on in their societies and in South America, the better. I have to say, I do get the sense that there's big things happening in South America, and South America seems to be taking a very strange turn at the moment. I mean, it's a left-wing turn, but it's a left-wing turn which seems to be, if I could say so, closer to Seattle and California type left than any Latin American left that I can remember. And I wonder how it's going to turn out. I suspect not very well is the short answer.
From Raphael, China and Russia see themselves superior to the USA.
I don't really know actually about that. So I don't think the Russians do. I think that the Russians know the US quite well now. I mean, they've been involved with the US for a very long time. I think they're intimidated by it to some extent because, they see it as this very powerful, very rich country. And they lost the Cold War, as they've come to feel themselves. And I don't think they see themselves as superior to the USA. I think the US does exasperate them, and they are very and deeply frustrated by it. But I don't think that Russians are particularly hostile to the US as a society, or would want it to be an enemy to themselves. By contrast, I think in China, there is a tremendous sense at the moment that China is on the way and it's moving forward. And I think the Chinese are much more self-confident with respect to the US than the Russians are. That's certainly my feeling overall.
Yeah. Rhubarb Pie sends us a super chat, $20 super chat. Thank you very much, Rhubarb Pie, for that. Flying Boar, what's an update on France and Australia?
Well, the French are now sending their ambassador back. The Australians have apparently accepted that doing all those deals with the nuclear submarines in secret was a mistake. It looks like some sort of attempt to patch things up is underway. But I suspect now that Macron's real focus is not going to be on Australia anymore. He's now going to drive and push and prod for this great European army, of which he imagines himself to be Napoleon at the head of. I don't think it's going to work, but I think that's really what he wanted, what he's going to really try and do.
European army. I agree with that. Mm-hmm. Flying Boar, who has an advantage right now on European gas, Russia or EU?
Well, Russia. I think straightforward.
Have the gas.
Straightforward answer. The Russians do. I mean, if we're talking about, a real crisis and a bargaining this winter, who is in a stronger position to bargain? The country that has the gas, where the lights are on, the heating is working, the supply chains are operating, the people are fed and clothed and warm, or the place that's suffering the power cuts, the shortages, the electricity outages, the supply chain problems. It seems to me in any kind of situation, straightforwardly, it's the Russians. It has to be. And by the way, I think that, at some point, the self-preservation will kick in, and we will see Europeans making all kinds of concessions to the Russians to get the gas moving. We'll probably see Nord Stream 2 licensed and operating. We'll see the third energy package issue massaged out of the way. But it will all leave a very bad taste in the mouth. And I suspect the Russians will be even more exasperated with the Europeans than they have previously been. It's actually, again, worth reading Putin's comments, because he's clearly utterly fed up with the Europeans. I mean, his comments about them are scathing. He is furious about this. He's furious about the way Russia is being blamed, and he clearly regards the Europeans as a bunch of incompetents and amateurs. And that perception will stay. That ill feeling will fester, and it will get worse.
Yeah. From Simon, U.S. September jobs report, 194,000. Biden depression, ?
I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's we discussed this, I think, in a recent program. I think there is a fair chance that we could see a recession in the US next year. I'm not saying that for certain, because the economic situation is now so unstable. But I would not be surprised if we saw 7% inflation in April. The Federal Reserve having to increase interest rates and tighten monetary policy to try to smother it, whatever. And
it didn't have to be like this, yeah. Go on.
And then we could see a recession in the US. I'm not saying all that will happen. I think the resistance to raising interest rates is going to be huge. But if they don't raise interest rates, then of course inflation could go even higher. That will cut into people's incomes, that will reduce spending. We will see all sorts of other problems intensify, and that could also create a recession. So, I'm not definitely saying that will happen, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's the whole thing was so
self-inflicted.
Self-inflicted. Took the very words out of my mouth. It's so completely self-inflicted. He inherited a recovering economy. It was growing strongly by itself. What he did, instead of throttling back and letting things take their course, he rammed his foot down on the accelerator. And what's happened? He's running out of gas. I mean, it's inevitable. If you shoot forward before you've filled up your tank, of course you run out of gas. So I mean, a recession is now quite possible. In which case, by the way, we expect more trouble for us all on social media, more restrictions, more controls, more demands for scapegoats, all that kind of thing, more campaigns against Russians, spreading disinformation. All of that will escalate next year on a scale like we've probably never seen.
Yeah, we're spreading disinformation while the White House has a completely another set outside of the White House. Yeah. Where they're running their press conferences and their speeches.
Exactly.
It's just complete kabuki theater. It's complete theater.
Yes, absolutely.
The whole administration, Biden administration, is a work of fiction. It really is.
Yes. I mean, I have to say, I think Americans are seeing through it now. I mean, even many Americans who voted for it. I mean, the polling figures are terrible, and independents who voted for Biden in last year seem to be switching sides at accelerating speed. I think, as I said, it is. It's like the Wizard of Oz. We're now seeing the person behind the curtain, except of course there isn't even a person behind the curtain. There's absolutely no one there anymore because it's all falling apart.
The reason why they've built a complete another set. This is what I believe Stephen Miller or Jason Miller, who was the Trump White House consultant, he said that they've built another set for Biden because he can't give his speeches. He can't read his speeches from the Oval Office with a teleprompter. What he needs a flat screen TV prompter in order to read the words that are being dictated to him. He can't use a simple teleprompter. It's too difficult. That was his explanation of it. And that's why they've built a completely another set outside of the White House for him to give his prepared speeches. Otherwise, if he was in the Oval Office, it would be such a mess up, such a cluster F, if people know what I mean, when he was trying to read his speeches, that it was just unworkable.
Absolutely. Well, that is entirely plausible. But then, of course, they've not just done it. They've just done it so badly. I mean, the whole thing looks cheap and tacky, and so I mean, it's bad in a way that they've had to do that, and it shows up the problems that the man has, but then they haven't even covered that up properly. They haven't even done a convincing copy of the Oval Office that people can at least pretend to believe in. I mean, what they see instead is something that looks obviously like a projection and an image. I mean, it's just the whole thing is just, I mean, it's a shambles.
Wouldn't they just be better off just telling the American people before they did this, look, we're going to be doing our speeches. President Biden's going to be doing his speeches from this office building across the White House because he's more comfortable there, because it's easier for him to read. They would have been much better off just spinning it like that instead of trying to fool the American people into thinking this is the actual Oval Office, and these are the plants in the window, these digitally enhanced plants, these green screen plants over there, and this is the Oval Office, when it's complete fiction.
I completely agree. I think that is entirely right. I mean, simply say, that he finds it easier and more comfortable to speak from this location. You could even, if you like, make things like, that his eyesight means that he needs a bigger screen. People are very accepting of these things. But the reason they didn't do that is because they are insecure. They are well aware that he isn't, let's put it like this, the most vigorous of people, and they're also well aware that the American people weren't properly informed about that last year. So rather than be straightforward about it, they have to try and conceal the fact by engaging in all of these dodges. So it portrays their own insecurity and their weakness, that they can't really acknowledge these simple facts.
Have you ever seen anything like this in the history of the United States, Alexander? Anything comparable from a president?
No, I've never seen
all?
anything comparable to this.
I mean, I've heard stories about Kennedy, for example, that he had chronic pain and stuff like this, but he kept on going. This is what I've heard about Kennedy.
Yeah.
I don't know how true it is, but I can't think of anything comparable to this. Or Reagan in his second term.
Yeah, it is absolutely true about Kennedy. He had severe back pain and he had all kinds of physical problems, but he was absolutely in control. He was making the decisions. He was visible. He was alert, as he showed, by the way, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a tremendous orator. He was a tremendous personality. He was fully able to execute the office of president despite his physical issues, and it was never a problem. And yes, Reagan at the very end was beginning to become was slowing down and whatever, but again, it was never like this. Bear in mind, when Reagan began to slow down, well, he'd already been president for a while, and he'd already made all the big decisions, all the really key decisions in his presidency, and people were already beginning to look beyond him anyway. And of course, he had in George H.W. Bush a vice president who maybe was not, everybody's, to everybody's taste, but was a capable man in his way. He'd been former director of the CIA. He was certainly somebody who could make decisions. There's never been an administration like this one, where the president who is elected was elected without any admission of his underlying problems, even though they were perfectly visible. And even though, there was all that gossip that was going on during the election about those problems, but there was all this attempt that everybody was colluding in to try and pretend that those problems weren't there, and where the vice president is a complete failure, and a visible failure,
and a no-show
as well, and a no-show. I've never known anything like this. I've never known an administration that is so hollow. I mean, this is something that has never, to my knowledge, happened in the United States before. There have been bad presidents. There have been incompetent presidents in the past. There have been, all sorts of people who really weren't up to the job, but no one who is, an empty suit, leading an empty administration in the way that we're seeing now.
All right. Cosmic Rain coming in with a 50-pound super chat. Given the state of things, I think the saying, "we're not in Kansas anymore," holds a lot of truth. Although in this case, I'd replace Kansas with Earth. At times, I wish I could leave Earth and go search for another planet to live on.
Well, I'm afraid that option isn't with us. I'm afraid, but who knows? I mean, here we see the Wizard of Oz coming along, and again, as I said, it is a fact. I mean, it is a troubling situation, because whatever one may say, the United States remains the pivot of the international system, both diplomatically and economically. I mean, China is very powerful, but it isn't pivotal in the way that the US is. You need always in the White House, at the center of American power, somebody who's able to make the decisions and be in charge. And we don't have that at the moment. And if everywhere else in the West, people were capable and knew what they were doing, then of course it perhaps would be less of a problem. But when, we have Macron and, who knows whom in Germany, and Ursula von der Leyen and Christine Lagarde, and all of these people are running things. Well, you probably do feel sometimes as if, we wish something would come along and you could escape planet
These
Earth.
horrible people in these positions of power.
Yeah. I mean, they aren't just horrible, but they're incompetent as well.
Horrible, incompetent.
Yeah.
Godless. I mean, just.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh
So,
my
I mean,
God.
so I share the sentiment, but unfortunately, we don't have the option. The only option we have is to do what we're doing now, talk about these things, and work to try and make them better. Not easy.
Yeah. Russell Hall says the thing is, there's plenty of competent people in the US, but the powers that be have become so nakedly corrupt, they can't rely on any of them.
That
Good
is
point.
so true. There is an abundance of decent, hardworking, loyal, highly competent, immensely skilled, brilliant people in the US. The US has a massive abundance of such people. The problem is the center, the core. You know, there's that expression that a fish rots from the head down, and you know, it's at the head. It's the political class that is incompetent, corrupt, and is preventing all those enormously talented and decent and patriotic and loyal people from doing what they can definitely do.
All right. I'm in locals, and DGAR says Woodrow Wilson's wife was believed to run the show during his administration. That is correct. I have heard.
That's
I have read
absolutely.
that.
I've heard that, and there was the Colonel House, who was the sort of chief of staff. The problem with Wilson, of course, that happened a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about 100 years ago, and not only that, but of course, the world was different then. So the United States was much more decentralized. What the president did or didn't do didn't matter to such an extent, and the United States was not at the very center of the international political, military, economic system in the way that it is now. So you could ride then with an ill and infirm president in a way that you can't today. And I would add something else, of course, that when Woodrow Wilson became president, and he's a controversial figure, by the way, in the United States, and for many good reasons, but the Wilson that was elected was not a decrepit figure. The Biden that was elected was a decrepit figure. I'm sorry to put it as bluntly as that. And that is something that's never happened in the United States before.
Yeah. Elia puts the year 1913 there in the live stream.
Absolutely. No.
Is that where we're at this moment in time, Alexander?
Well, 1913. Well, I hope not. I mean, I think there are important differences. I mean, it's difficult to go back to the world of 1913, but 1913 was a time of economic boom. Actually, I mean, countries were becoming prosperous. They were becoming richer. One of the reasons there was a First World War is because Germany was becoming worried that Russia was booming and its economy was growing so fast. And there were great weaknesses in the political system. The political leaders were extremely weak in many European countries, and very bad and incompetent decisions were made, and things easily spiraled out of control. And you can see those parallels. Well, I'm going to have to say this. Bad as those leaders were in 1913, this generation of leaders we have today seems to me much worse. So that is an alarming fact. But of course, the risks are so much greater now than they were even in 1913. And, one wonders, we'll just have to wait and see where we are. I think, there are similarities, there are differences. We just have to keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. And at the same time, talk out, speak out, argue, organize, and hopefully people, that will make a difference.
You said that you were very interested in the Civil War when you read about the Civil War. Yeah. One of the things that has always interested me was that time period in Russia, the transition from Tsarist Russia to Bolshevik Russia. And I know you're an expert in that area as well, Alexander. But one thing that maybe we could try to do, we have to see if we can work it out, is talk about that time period, because it is very relevant to what's happening now, what happened in that transition. And we've talked a little bit about World War I in this live stream, but perhaps that may not be a bad idea to talk about what happened then and how it relates now, because I think while there are a lot of differences, like you said, there are a lot of parallels, and there are a lot of people talking about the transition of the United States to some sort of socialist Bolshevik structure, which is very worrying. But what do you think of what I've just said and the parallels and discussing these things? Because I think it was always a very interesting time period in Russia, what happened, and in Europe in general. And maybe that is what's happening in the United States to a certain extent.
I think the parallels are striking, actually, and we should certainly do a program about it. You're quite right, by the way.
But like a series, maybe. I'm just throwing it out there, and maybe people in the live stream can also weigh in if they'd like to see that, if they'd like to watch that.
I mean, one of the things that happened in pre-revolutionary Russia was that there was a liberal movement in pre-revolutionary Russia, which was demented in the level of its opposition to the government. I mean, absolutely, off the scale, profoundly corrupt, profoundly connected with certain oligarchical elements within the business community, and looking for power at all costs, and absolutely willing to see everything fall apart in the confident belief that if they did fall apart, it would inherit and take control. And of course, what actually happened is that things turned out otherwise, but they opened up a massive political space to the left of them, because, of course, they supported. I mean, this is a fact people don't understand. One of the reasons the Bolshevik Party became so strong is because it had so much support for the liberals, and powerful Russian,
the liberals in the Duma, the liberal oligarchs.
The liberals in the Duma and the liberal oligarchs. One of the most powerful Russian industrialists, a man called Sava Morozov, was actually funding the Bolsheviks. It is extraordinary today, but I mean, he was.
It sounds familiar to what's happening today, though, doesn't
it? Exactly. I mean, a lot of that was going on, and again, because and there was this slogan that the liberals had: "No enemies to our left." Everything, however extreme, however radical, however terroristic you were on the left, you were our friend. All our enemies were, the conservatives, the right, the government, the Tsar, the imperial family, all that sort of thing. And of course, they didn't inherit Russia. They created a revolution in which they were all swept away. So that's the great irony of it. But I mean, it created an astonishing witch's brew of things in pre-revolutionary Russia, which is enormously interesting. And again, I mean, all these various people that were around at that time, names that are today forgotten. I mean, very few people today remember people like Guchkov and Shulgin and all these sort of liberal politicians of that period. But they are very similar to the Adam Schiffs and the Pelosi's of today. And their capacity for intrigue, by the way, is identical.
Yeah. And a civil war that followed.
Oh, the civil war that followed, absolutely. There was
a terrible civil war that followed,
Terrible civil war. Which, by the way, the Russians are now increasingly trying to come to terms with. There was an interesting decision to build a statue in, I think, Sevastopol, in which you see a white Russian and a red Russian, the two sides, and then they're sort of embracing each other or something of that kind, or shaking hands. I mean, an attempt to try and get past the effect of the Civil War. Whether that's going to be possible or not, we will see. But a civil war which was utterly traumatizing, and which led to many of the problems that followed, because civil wars are a disaster for any country which experiences them.
Yeah. All right. Simon says France 1940, extreme internal division. US 2021.
Simon is absolutely right. France also. I mean, not perhaps on the scale of Tsarist Russia, but again, extraordinary problems. And by the way, you see many of the same features that we've talked about in the run-up to the collapse in 1940 in France. Corruption, oligarchs, hedonism, extraordinary. That also is true in Russia, by the way, before the revolution, and extraordinary
hedonism.
Hedonism,
really?
Yeah, absolutely, in both places. All of that coming to the fore. Extraordinary cynicism in politics, intrigues, and massive social divisions, which leave societies extremely fragile and unable to respond. By the way, the French in the 30s produced some extraordinary films charting that period. And if you are familiar with French cinema of that time, you'll find, people like Renoir, the French director, brother, by the way, of Paul Renoir, the artist. You'll find that he made many films at that time which highlight the extraordinary corruption of French society during that time.
I hear so many parallels to what's going on today. I really do.
You see, the fundamental difference, and the thing that I find dismaying about the United States, is that Russia in, the run-up to the revolution had, long historic problems, and it was not, it had not been a country built on a constitutional or democratic system. So it lacked, if you like, that foundation. The United States has had that foundation. And that's why I never imagined that I'd ever see it in the United States. Well, there we go.
Yeah, but that's why they're trying to tear down that foundation. I mean, that's why there's such an effort to tear down the Constitution, because it's that foundation, that Constitution is that document that separates the United States and holds the country together. If they can tear down that Constitution, water it down, make it less significant, then you are on the path to what we saw happen in the 1913, 1917, etc.
I completely agree. It's only that, I never expected to see it. I'd always thought that Americans were, very attached to their constitution and would never allow a thing like this to happen in their own societies. But, happen it is. And it's very bizarre. The parallels are there, and they certainly need to be explored.
Well, that's why you go after free speech, Alexander, because that's the bedrock of it all. If you can knock out the free speech, then eventually you can make your way up to the Second Amendment and just start knocking all of these out.
Absolutely. There's a very we go back to Russia. There's a very famous phrase, and I can never remember who it was. I think it was Alexander Blok, who is a Russian poet, who wrote about some event that happened in the 1880s, 1890s. And he said that this was the moment when we stopped being able to talk to each other. It was no longer, from up to then, every Russian, whatever their views, had been able to talk to every other Russian. But after this event, we were no longer able to talk to each other openly and freely. And that was what led to everything else.
Yeah. I agree with that. From Marit, during the Corona crisis, Modena, Italy, the third biggest center in the world and biggest in Europe that develops and produces biomed devices, ventilators, etc., supplied equipment to Italy and the EU, and EU doesn't acknowledge them.
Well, there we go.
Doesn't
doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I'm not aware of that, but that particular fact, but it's entirely consistent with what we see. The EU runs everything on an ideological basis framework. It doesn't have the kind of managerial outlook that it can't do, because the EU itself is an ideological construct. So to expect it to run things in a managerial way is to expect the impossible. That's not what it's about ultimately.
Yeah. Russell Hall says Biden looks like he's stumbling through a bad CG fever dream from the mid-1990s because he's relying on corrupted buffoons.
No, absolutely.
Well said. Raphael says, I believe the reason Putin is a modern Peter the Great and Lenin and Stalin are more of Ivan the Terrible, and the two were not so successful.
Well, that is a huge topic to discuss. All I will say about it is that Putin has never, by the way, compared himself with Peter the Great. I mean, he's always avoided those kind of comparisons. I know some people make them. And Stalin most definitely did compare himself with Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny. And he actually commissioned this film by the Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein, about Ivan the Terrible, which was supposed to relate to Stalin. And Stalin got very, very concerned about it because he felt that the way that Ivan was portrayed in that film actually was, in fact, not such as reflected well on Stalin himself. And so, I mean, Stalin made those comparisons with Ivan the Terrible. I don't think Putin makes comparisons with Peter the Great, actually. Putin does not like radical changes. He doesn't want to turn things upside down, which of course Peter did. What Putin likes to do is to incrementally improve things. He does it very methodically, very steadily, often over a very long time. So the change comes steadily, methodically, incrementally, often without being very noticeable until suddenly you notice it. And most Russians, in my experience, who are very familiar with political turmoil, actually like that. And that's one of the reasons why they support him to the extent they do.
Yeah. Flying Boar asks, is it Norway got lots of gas? Why can't they provide it to Europe?
Well, they have got lots of gas. I believe less than they did, but they still have quite a lot. But of course, it's not enough. I mean, this is the thing to always understand. I mean, even Russia doesn't supply all of Europe's gas. It supplies, I believe, something like 40% of it. Norway provides its share. Algeria provides its share. No single country. I mean, the way they talk about Russia, you'd think that Russia was the sole supplier. It's not. But there is a limit to what any one of these countries can do. Ultimately, Russia has the biggest reserves, and it could contribute more. But even Russia can't fulfill everything. And Russia doesn't have unlimited supplies of gas, which is, by the way, another thing Europeans don't seem to understand. I was reading the IAEA, which has now been enlisted in the anti-Russia, anti-Putin campaign. Again, they seem to imagine that the Russians can supply unlimited amounts of gas, at will, just, pulling a switch or, conjuring it up out of the air or something. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Raphael says, let us not go around on this. China attacked the submarines to make it clear to the U.S. that they are done effing around with them, period.
I wouldn't know, but I mean, this business with the USS Connecticut, this Seawolf submarine, it's interesting, and I'm not quite sure where this collision happened, but a collision does obviously mean an underwater object, and a submarine, another submarine. All rather worrying and all rather concerning. And of course, if it was done intentionally, and I know these things happened between the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War, then very concerning indeed.
Yeah, and Flying Boar asks the update on the U.S. submarine collision in the South China Sea. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I don't, again, we have so little information at the moment. The US has been very, very tight-lipped about what happened. What I'm going to say is this. Firstly, Seawolf submarines are amongst the most sophisticated submarines that the US Navy has. And it's interesting that they were operating there, as that particular submarine was operating there, as opposed to, say, the North Atlantic and the Arctic. So, the US is clearly deploying nuclear submarines, very advanced nuclear submarines, to the Pacific. And that has to be in response to China and the development of Chinese naval power. Now, is this a clash some kind of incident involving Chinese and American nuclear submarines? Possibly. I think before we speculate about these things, we should have some more information. We can glean some facts. The fact that that submarine was there, we don't know what it was doing. We don't know how this incident happened. We don't know what it collided with. Until we know more, then I think we should hold back a little and not speculate too much.
All right. Cromer says, good Lord, you guys should have seen the aftermath of the TV series Chernobyl on the internet. Endless anti-nuclear sentiment and misinformation. That was the HBO series, yeah.
I didn't watch it partly for that reason.
Yeah. And and Can US says, as per your comment, Alexander, about the level of discontent and political tension in Britain, I can tell you in Canada, on the West Coast, there is a level of outright panic and fear all about. Vancouver is not much different to Seattle and Portland. A whiff of decay is about. Disorder, even as the level of authoritarianism grows daily. Justin has presided over the creation of a panic-demic.
Yes, absolutely. Because, of course, the way people like this win elections is by fostering panic. I mean, you can already see the narrative. And of course, it worked for Trudeau, by the way, in Canada. I mean, he's said, vote for me, or if you don't vote for me, all these terrible people with all these dangerous reactionary ideas will come into power and they'll do terrible things. And you can already see the things saying, the narrative being built up in the US. If you don't vote for the Democrats, you're going to get the bad orange man back, and not just him, but all sorts of terrible people are there waiting in the background to swoop in, and democracy is at stake unless you vote for us. And that means we got to act to suppress and close down and regulate and prevent any kind of speech. I was reading some extraordinary articles about this, for example, in places like the Financial Times, which is widely read in the US, as I happen to know. And there's an article by a man called Marcus Wolf in which he was saying straightforwardly, that there's a threat to democracy from the Republican Party, and making it so existential that you get the sense that anything is permitted to prevent the Republicans winning the midterms next year, because they're somehow going to threaten democracy. He didn't exactly explain what this threat to democracy that the Republicans pose is, but that's the kind of language and the kind of panic that is being spread. And we're going to see a lot more of that next year in the US. That I am absolutely sure is coming, because without it, how are the Democrats going to hold on to Congress? I can't see it.
Exactly.
So that's what they're going to be doing.
And Cromer says, can these people even be considered leaders?
No, they're not
Good
leaders.
They're not.
That's a very good point. They're not leaders. They are people who surf the wave, if you like, of panic, of fear, of hysteria, and of ideology, and who serve the interests of the very powerful forces that operate behind the scenes, which have become more powerful than at any other time that I can think of or can remember. Yeah.
Simon says, impact of Soros-funded DAs in the US, discuss.
Huge question. I can't identify all of them, but again, the politicization of the American judicial system is again something that I would never have imagined before. And we saw that right through the period of Trump's administration, where he was endlessly harassed. I mean, I remember, the law, the decree, the executive order that he published about, restricting entry into the United States of people from the Middle East. And there were all these judges across America who basically stopped its implementation. And eventually, after ages, it finally got to the Supreme Court, and it was accepted that it was entirely within his constitutional prerogatives to make it, as was always obvious. And I cannot see how DAs, judges, those sort of people could not be aware of that fact. And these are not any longer people who are executing or administering the law of the United States. They are political figures backed by certain forces in the United States who are implementing an agenda and are using the law or using their positions in the law to pursue it.
Yeah. Rich said Spain was demonized in the 16th century, as during that time it was the Spanish fury that threatened European values.
That's so true. There's a whole. I have another book about this, the so-called Black Legend, which refers, by the way, to the legend of Spain in the 16th century. This supposed authoritarian, autocratic, medieval superpower that was going to conquer the whole of Europe and impose its ideas on it and all of that. And this did have a very, very powerful effect on European opinion at that time. And it did, in fact, continue. It continues to this day to affect people's understanding of Spain during that period and subsequently. And of course, this is the Spain of Cervantes and of Velázquez and of all of these great artists and great cultural figures. But of course, people don't ever seem to see that.
Yeah. Simon follows up to that super chat by noting that he's talking about Chicago DA releasing the gang members without bail, and Mayor Lightfoot objected. That was in the news. I believe that was a couple of days ago.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
But
well, I mean,
it's all part of it.
Well, of course it is. I mean, again, I mean, they're not administering the law in.
They're not administering the
law.
I
mean, that's the fundamental point.
Yeah. Ian says, with the UK and Japan getting closer in naval terms, can you see Japan expanding their fleets and air power under the Treaty of Defense only?
It's possible, and in fact, not just possible, it's quite likely. I mean, and Japan, to be very clear, has the potential to do that. All the industrial, technological skills to do it. It's got the maritime traditions to do it. We shall see. I mean, I know that there are many people in Japan who are opposed, and apparently the new Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, is said to be rather more skeptical of these ideas. But we'll see what happens. I mean, it's not just Japan's decision. I mean, it's also partly depends on what the other great powers do, what the US does, and what Japan does, or what China does, and what the Chinese do, and what Japan then does in response. So it wouldn't surprise me. And by the way, British-Japanese naval cooperation goes back all the way to the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah. Flying Boar says, what British did to Afrikaners during the Anglo-Boer War was a famine. No wonder Afrikaners nationalists do not like English speakers in their neighborhood.
That's absolutely true, and that's completely correct. And if you read accounts of what happened in South Africa during the Boer War, they are just awful. I mean, awful isn't. I mean, I struggle to find a word for it. It is a very dark page in British history. Of course, not the only one. I mean, the British Empire did terrible things to many people around the world, in India, in China, in Africa, in many parts of Africa. And they certainly did that to the Afrikaners.
Yeah. Neil O'Keefe, thank you for your $1 super chat. Let's see. Flying Boar says, Putin recently made comments on Nord Stream 2 and Ukraine transit. Any update on it?
Absolutely. Now, that I'm glad somebody's brought that up, because in my opinion, these have been profoundly misrepresented, certainly in parts of the British, in the Western media, because it's been suggested that Putin basically indicated that gas transit through Ukraine would continue. What he actually said, and it's really actually very, very interesting, is that apparently Gazprom, despite having transit contracts with Ukraine to supply gas to Europe via Ukraine, it actually wants to tear up those contracts. It feels that sending gas through Ukraine is no longer economic, that the infrastructure there is very poor, and that rather than send gas through Ukraine, Gazprom would prefer to stop doing so and pay any compensation or fines that it was ordered to pay as a result of it reneging on those contracts, and prefer instead to send gas to Europe via the new pipelines, which are much more modern, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, Turk Stream, and the rest. And Putin said to them, no, don't do that. You have a responsibility as a reliable gas supplier to abide by your contracts, your existing contracts. You must comply with those contracts, even if it's costly for you to do that. That is your responsibility. Your reputation is on the line. You must therefore continue to send gas via Ukraine. But Putin was only talking about the existing gas transfer contracts, and they expire in 2024. Now, if you follow through the logic of all of these discussions, what they show is that Gazprom does not want to send gas to Europe via Ukraine anymore. And that suggests strongly that when those contracts expire in 2024, exactly, Gazprom will no longer want to send gas via Ukraine, and that will be the end of
game over
of Ukraine as a transit state.
Good job, Obama. Yeah. Good job, McCain. Good job, Kerry. Good job, Biden. You wrecked the country. Congratulations. Pardeep says $5 super chat. Has the Great Reset failed?
Yes, as it was bound to. Except, of course, some people won't acknowledge that, and they will try to keep pushing it, and so it will fail even more, and we'll all pay the price. That's the trouble.
Yeah. Russell Hall says they need to normalize the silencing of dissent. We were talking about the U.S. and absolutely. Censorship and everything, going after the Constitution. Absolutely. Let's see, where am I here? Flying Boar says my grandmother's side killed by British during Anglo-Boer War in the early 1900s, just to let you know.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. And as I said, it's a disgraceful chapter in British history, and one, by the way, that is very little known about in Britain. Few people in Britain know it, but the vast majority of the British public don't know about it. I mean, there is some knowledge in Britain about, other things the empire did, but you won't find many people in Britain who will, want to knock down statues of Cecil Rhodes because of what he did to the Boers, what he did to the people in Zimbabwe, the black people. Well, that, of course, they will knock his statue down over. But over what he did to the Boers, well, that's not part of their agenda at all. That's not any cause for concern.
Yeah. French from Heyman. French-Russian dispute in Mali over the mercenaries.
Oh, that's an interesting story. Now, that is a very interesting story because, of course, the French were backing the government of Mali against secessionist forces in the north and various jihadi groups that are based there. And they seem to be minded to pull their troops out of Mali. And so Mali has been talking to the Russians about getting mercenaries from the Wagner group to take over where the French are leaving, and the French don't like that at all, and they're complaining about it, and the European Union is furious about it, and the European High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, complained about it to Lavrov and said, stay out of Africa. Africa is ours. Apparently, he said it as bluntly as that, and Lavrov was both shocked and furious, but that's Borrell for you, and all sorts of things going on like this. Now, it's a complicated one, actually, because there is a view, which I am aware of, that in fact Mali isn't really interested in these mercenaries from Russia at all, and that the government in Mali really is using this issue of the Russian mercenaries to gain leverage over the Americans and the Europeans, so as to get the Americans and the Europeans to commit to Mali. And that's really what this is all about. In other words, that it's really more theatre. than anything else. But Mali does need support if it is to hold together and if it is to defeat this insurgency. And the Malians are frankly very angry, seem to be very angry with the Europeans and with the Western powers. And there is a row going on. And it could be that this deal with the Wagner Group turns out to be for real. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. I don't know how effective these mercenaries are. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I'm not somebody who likes mercenaries. I'm not somebody who thinks much of the Wagner Group. In fact, I think this is a sordid business, and I'd much rather the Russians weren't involved in it. Okay. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Raphael says, let me be the first to say it. Within 5 years, Russia and China are going to ask NATO to be disbanded without any fanfare. Call me crazy if you want to.
No, I don't call you crazy at all. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'll tell you something, actually. I think my own personal view about NATO is that far from it being an asset for the United States, it's actually a burden. It means that the United States is forced to work in all kinds of ways in Europe, where if it were free of NATO, it would free its hands and would be able to work much more much more in its own interests. In a way, I think Trump sensed this. NATO actually ties the US down. I don't know whether the Americans, many people in the US understand that, but that's the reality of what NATO is. The big beneficiaries of NATO are some Europeans and, of course, the American military industrial complex. Don't see that the US really gains at all much from it.
And the tens of thousands of people that work in NATO offices.
And all those.
It's a massive bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Russell says the problem with nuclear is one of scale. If you have a handful of plants producing radioactive waste, it's manageable. More and it becomes a problem.
I understand that. And I would say that running a nuclear power industry is something which perhaps is better done by a big country with a strong administration and lots of engineers and technical managers and people of that kind. So I understand that point, and I think it's a very valid one. I still think that a lot of the agitation against nuclear power in Europe has been misguided. And I would have thought that if any country in Europe could run nuclear power stations well, Germany would be that one.
Yeah. Rich says Italians have revolutionized West Europe many times, from Rome to Italian Renaissance to Savonarola pre-Reformation to Napoleon. Hope they do it again.
Oh, well, it wouldn't surprise me. Italy is the sleeping giant of Europe. If the Italians assert themselves as they can, then of course they can make everything shake, and without them the EU falls apart. But they need the political will and the self-confidence to do it. And what Italy lacks is both will and self-confidence. They're very, very much in awe of the Germans and the French. And as a result, they don't assert themselves as strongly as they could do.
Yeah. Let's see. Shifu has a comment in Locals, which is actually another super chat on YouTube. It's the same topic. The WSJ story about U.S. Special Ops training Taiwan Army.
Yeah.
Is it true? And the super chat from Brando Commando is, did you guys read the WSJ story about U.S. Naval Marine officers training Taiwanese armed forces? No comment about stationed U.S. troops, but tensions keep rising, and I don't think either side knows the repercussions of a hot war.
I think that's entirely right on both counts. I have no doubt at all that this story is true. I have no doubt that those US troops are in Taiwan. I have no doubt that they are training the Taiwanese. I don't know, by the way, and I rather doubt that this is anything particularly new. I mean, you must remember Taiwan and the US have a very long historic relationship going all the way back to 1950. So I'd be very surprised if this was actually new or that it broke any particular new ground. And of course, the Chinese government is very well aware of all of this. It's inconceivable that they're not aware that this kind of thing is going on in Taiwan. So I don't know that this is necessarily new, but it is a reflection. It is a sign of how the US and Taiwan are increasingly working together, and that is increasingly creating problems between China and the US, and China and Taiwan also, by the way. And the rhetoric between the two sides is becoming increasingly confrontational. There was a utter failure of a meeting between Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan in Zurich. We covered it both on the Duran, and I covered it separately on my channel. I mean, they didn't in the end agree on anything. And at the same time, we now hear that American submarines are colliding with mysterious objects. So, I mean, this is not a good situation. And I think the risks for a miscalculation and for things going wrong is very high, even though I generally don't believe that either side actually really wants a war. I don't see that it benefits either, but they're on an escalator of escalation that neither really seems able to get off. And again, I'm going to have to say this may not be entirely popular with many people, with some people, but I think that the biggest mistakes are being made on the American side, because I think the American side doesn't understand that on Taiwan, China simply can't retreat. This is such a core issue, such an existential issue for China, that they're not going to back down over it or compromise over it in the way that I think some people in the United States think they will. So I think that's where the bigger miscalculation is, but it's certainly a very, very worrying situation indeed.
Yeah, and Raphael says, when you ask your wife to go out so that we can have a talk, and she says, never mind. This is Biden and Xi. Raphael says, she doesn't respect you anymore as anything.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Biden and Xi, yeah. They don't get along.
They do not get along. And it's a fact, by the way, contrast that with Trump and Xi. Trump was very tough on China, but Xi actually liked him. They got on very well.
Yeah, and Shifu says, why did the oligarchs hate Trump so much? He did more to benefit the wealthy class than any president in history.
Do you know, I don't think he actually did exactly. I mean, there's been a lot of granular studies now done about his tax changes. And I've actually seen academic studies, which I actually believe, which is they say that his tax changes were ultimately progressive, that in fact the reductions in tax were more than made up for the very wealthy class by the abolition of exemptions and reliefs, and that in fact the reductions in tax on middle class and working class people actually benefited them, so that overall the tax changes were progressive, and that played a very big role in solidifying working class support for Trump in the run-up to the election last year. So that's what I've read. But I think the reason fundamentally why the oligarchy hates Donald Trump is because he doesn't share their ideological view. He's not a globalist. He believes in America first. He wants to develop America's industrial and infrastructure base, or that's what he said. He doesn't want to see them moving money around the world and opening factories in China and Mexico and such places. And of course, that isn't something they like at all. And ultimately, whatever the tax changes he did within the United States, whether it benefited them or not, the fact that he was opposed to these things and wanted an American first policy was ultimately worse for them than, whatever tax benefits he gave them. And I think that was why they hated him.
Yeah. Heyman says there's a quiet recoupling happening, in my opinion.
Right. Recoupling between whom and whom.
I mean, throw that in the live stream, man. So we can get to that. A quiet recoupling. Russell Hall says China may not be willing to retreat on Taiwan, but they certainly could. They've gotten by without it so far. Taiwan has never been part of the PRC.
No, it's never been part of the PRC, but the PRC system is very much based upon Taiwan being part of China. And the PRC today, the Communist Party of China, it's very much the party that stands for Chinese nationalism, for one China, one government, one a united territorial complete China. It would be a major blow for the Communist Party's legitimacy in China if Taiwan were to be seen to break away. It would probably be a political crisis in China, a legitimacy crisis, which the Chinese Communist Party is not going to entertain. And I believe beyond that, I mean, I think they generally believe that. Now, I think that the government in China, if things were to be left alone, if Taiwan were to continue as it has done as a de facto independent entity, but everybody, all the world continued to pretend or claim or say that one day it would reunite with China and is part of China, I think they would go along with that. But an open, straightforward declaration of independence by Taiwan would be something that I think they would just not be able to accept or allow. And I think at that point, I think they are in a position where they would have to take action.
Yeah. 6 more likes, Alexander, and we're at 1,000. 6 more. Come on, everybody, hit that like button. Let's see. From locals, Alexander, quite famously, the Imperial Japanese battlecruiser Congo was built in Britain. The namesake is actually used for the Japanese Arleigh Burke equivalent today.
Well, there you go. So that's this relationship between the Royal Navy and Britain and Japan goes back very, very far. When the Japanese sank the Russian Navy in the Straits of Tsushima during the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, they were using British Whitehead torpedoes.
All right. Thank you, everybody. 1,000 plus likes, 1,062. Thank you, everybody, for hitting that like. We really, really appreciate that. And Alexander, what do you think of the likelihood is that Brussels is consciously allowing this energy crisis to happen in order to legitimize the EU Green Deal and push for energy independence in the EU?
There might be some. Yeah.
Let me read you one more sentence. This plan for a green transition is a very risky move. And by creating this narrative that it is Putin who is forcing the EU to make this move, the leaders in Brussels may think that they will be able to avoid taking the blame for all the damage the Green Deal will do.
Well, I think there are probably some people in Brussels who do think like that. I mean, it's a crazy way of approaching things. I deliberately manufacture a crisis, create a switch off the lights across Europe, make people cold and hungry. I mean, no government in its senses does that to its own society. But we've talked about many times about how this is an ideologically driven exercise. And there are some people who do undoubtedly think that way. I'm not sure that the entire political class across Europe wants to go down that route, or shares that outlook, or is part of that kind of plan, because of course some of them still have to win elections. So I mean, it's probably a few people who think that way. But I don't think all of them do. And to be straightforward about it, looking at Ursula von der Leyen and people like that, I don't think people like her really are clever enough to come up with a scheme like that.
I don't know. So you mean the EU may actually be using fear in order to achieve more power and more money?
Oh, no.
Where have I heard that before? You mean the globalists are using fear to get more power?
I mean, what is much more likely to do, if they really were to pursue that kind of policy, is to do exactly what Alex was talking about earlier in the program, which is that people will just say enough's enough, and we'll see more countries like Hungary cutting their own deals. I mean, so if this is the plan, it's a bad plan. But, these people are bad people, and they could come up with bad plans, bad in more senses than one.
All right, Victor, thank you for your super sticker. We appreciate it. Ian says, Eric Zemmour, a new threat to Macron and establishment.
That is a very interesting question. And I'm trying to make sense of this business because he's come up out of nowhere And I can't help but wonder whether he's been helped along in order to draw support away from Le Pen. I say that because in France, these things are so carefully manipulated. Elections are so carefully manipulated. Having said that, if that is the case, then she's created the situation for herself because she moderated her position so much that she's opened the door for people like Zemmour. So I mean, maybe there's a degree of manipulation here, but she exactly she brought it on herself.
Yeah, she was positioned to do really well in the elections, and she moderated. She watered down her
absolutely
platform.
A few months ago, she was outpolling Macron. And now she's being outpolled by Zemmour. I mean, that is an astonishing crash.
Yeah. Zemmour is a big threat because he is much better in debate than Le Pen.
Absolutely. That's certainly true. Of course, he's a television star. He's got all the skills of debate that she doesn't have. I mean, she's always had her her weaknesses. And I mean, she lost her nerve. I mean, to say it straightforwardly.
Yeah. Should Serbia join the EU?
No, no one should.
It shouldn't. No, it should not. Raphael says, guys, so China can force Canada to release the lady in a New York minute. Can we say that the justice system is nothing in these two countries?
Well, I mean, can I just say the whole Meng Wanzhou thing was just a terrible business right from the start. It's a good example of the lawfare that is now taking place around the world. You don't have to like Huawei. You don't have to like China. You don't even have to like Meng Wanzhou. But the fact was that after she was arrested, it became very unclear what exact crime she had committed. There were allegations of wrongdoing, but as I've often pointed out to people, wrongdoing and crime are not necessarily the same things. And even the Canadian judge who was presiding over the extradition was struggling to make sense of what exact crime it was that she was alleged to have committed. So I think it was a geopolitical play. I think it worked. I think it meant that Huawei was pushed back. I think it meant that China wasn't able to involve itself in 5G systems and all those sort of things. And I think the company itself, which was at one point looking like a serious rival to Apple and Android and all those things, was just hammered backwards. But I mean, I don't like the way it was done.
Yeah. Russell Hall says, I don't believe the U.S., on the other hand, can afford to let Taiwan slip into Chinese hands, given our dependence on the country for technology.
Yes, I
Excellent
think that
point.
It's an excellent point, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think this is the point. This is where I think the China and the US could come to, if they have the ability, they could come to some kind of an understanding. Because I think what the US could say to the Chinese is, look, we can't accept that you just march in, take over Taiwan tomorrow. It's far too important for us, for the world economy. We can't see that happen. But we are prepared to go back to the arrangement that existed since the 70s, where we go along with the fiction that Taiwan is part of China. We continue to pretend that one day it will reunify with you, and we accept your sovereignty over the island, and we tell the Taiwanese under no circumstances should they declare independence of China, because that will simply rock the boat and create trouble between China and the United States and between for the rest of the world. And that would be bad for us, and it would be bad for Taiwan, and it would be bad for China as well, and it would be bad for the world. So I think there is that potential for a deal to be done there. And the Chinese have hinted that they would go along with that they accept that at this moment in time, reasserting China's direct control of Taiwan is not something that would be in China's interests for that very reason, and would involve conflict with the United States, which China would not want either. But the trouble is that I'm not sure that everybody in the United States is prepared to make that kind of deal. There are some people who see this as a sort of great, moral issue, and who don't understand that if they push, if Taiwan moves towards independence, then China is almost obliged to react, and that China doesn't want or would agree to something a lot less than control over Taiwan at this moment in time, but that it can't accept an outright independence of Taiwan, and that it will, as it has said many times, fight to prevent it.
Yeah. Where are we? Neil says, will the masses ever understand that all global leaders and governments are mere placeholders run by the Illuminati in Europe and the USA and Canada?
No, they won't accept it. I'm afraid I mean, there'll always be a lot of people who will, wonder about these things. But generally speaking, most people will always believe that politics is as it is presented to them. Having said that, people are becoming increasingly disaffected and angry. And of course, that has its own consequences. That might make politics more real again.
Well, just think about it. Maybe 6 years ago, you would never have talked about the deep state. The deep state wouldn't be in the mainstream the way it's talked about now. So people are becoming aware of a lot of different things that are going on behind the curtain.
That's absolutely right. That's completely true.
Mm-hmm. And let's see. I think we've got our last two super chats from Stan. Sell Detroit to China for free trade zone. Well, I don't know if that would work out for Detroit. I don't know.
Yeah, or for China, but
for China.
For China. Having said that, they've got very deep pockets at the moment, and they are shelling out on all sorts of things, not all of which are particularly viable. I mean, I should say, by the way, I mean, I've never discussed the Belt and Road Initiative, but a lot of it seems to me extremely ill-conceived and poorly thought out, and building railways where they're not needed and opening ports which might not actually service many ships and things of that kind. It's often the way when somebody who's got very rich very fast splashes out money in all directions without using or investing their money wisely. And, I do think the Chinese are doing a bit of that at the moment, more than a bit of that, actually.
Russell Hall says, did we accept Taiwan as part of China? The Taiwan Relations Act recognizes the governing authorities on Taiwan, which has always been the ROC.
This is entirely true. The United States acknowledged that Taiwan was a component part of China, and that the legitimate government of China was the government in Beijing back in the 1970s. And ever since then, as I said, it's never completely abandoned Taiwan. And by the way, even China doesn't ask that the US completely abandon Taiwan. But, it's gone along with this fiction that Taiwan is, this anomalous island that isn't quite a state and isn't quite a country. It's part of China, but it functions in every way like a state and like a country. I understand that this is galling for many Taiwanese. And, a lot of people in Taiwan are probably very frustrated by it. But it's an arrangement, a kind of compromise, if you like, that has worked. And it's, I think, worked quite well for Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan had very strong trading links with China, very strong trading links with the United States. It's developed a thriving and very prosperous society. And perhaps, being realistic, this isn't the moment to change it.
Yeah. Heyman says, after all, climate crisis is a China, EU, US grift.
Well, I'm afraid our friends in YouTube probably won't want us to discuss that much, but certainly it is a fact. This I will say. If you look at the places where people are talking about this topic, it is the three places that you've said. I mean, other countries, go along with it because, well, I mean, those are the three big centers of power. But it's really a narrative that is being promoted there. By the way,
go ahead, Alexander.
By the way, as a matter of historical fact, and I can prove it because I have some of the original magazines, the first place where scientists talked about climate change was the Soviet Union. There's a whole lot of articles that appeared in Soviet journals in the 1970s. I actually have one of them in English, in an original Soviet magazine that was published. I found it and collected it, in which you see the whole story, the whole science of climate change as we have it developed. It was propounded in the 1970s in the Soviet Union. Now, why and what was going on there about this, I have absolutely no idea. But it is weird how that was picked up and circulated around the world afterwards, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed. But the Russians don't talk much about climate change. The Chinese do. The Chinese talk about it a lot. So did the Europeans, of course, and so did the Americans.
Yeah, so a lot of cafes here, Alexander, are virtue signaling the climate change stuff. And when you go to get like a nice coffee, like a frappe or freddo, a typical Greek cold coffee, you'll get now the paper straw, right? And they'll give you the paper straw, and the coffee is inside a big plastic cup with a big plastic top. So you get the big plastic cup, the big plastic top, and a paper straw. And you sit there, you look at it, you go, okay, yeah, that works.
This is so well.
Yeah.
I'm rendered speechless. I mean, I just don't know what to say about that.
Yeah. Russell Hall says, and yet once again, we have officially declared our recognition for the separate government in charge of Taiwan.
Well, there we go. Have we? Is this a new announcement or something of this kind? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to
Maybe
know.
it references Biden's statement the other day that was being reported that he and Xi kind of came to some sort of an agreement. Remember that? It was reported in the news a couple of days ago. I haven't really heard a confirmation on it.
Right. No, nor have I. I think they stopped short of formal outright recognition. And it was Taiwan itself still calls itself the Republic of China. I mean, it hasn't yet formally declared independence. So, I think we're still some way from that, by the way. I think if we go there, I think that is a Chinese red line, and I think it's what we should take seriously.
Big red line. Flying Boar says, update on Belarus.
Ever closer union with Russia is the short answer. And my own personal view, and this is what I hear from people in Belarus, Lukashenko is fully in control again. So the sanctions have pushed him ever further closer to Russia. Of course, they've had their massive exercises, Zapad 2021, and Russia and Belarus are now rapidly integrating their industrial and agricultural economies. There's all this talk about a new constitution and about Lukashenko stepping down. If that does happen, you can be absolutely sure that the Russians will be involved in picking his successor.
Another successful EU regime change operation.
Absolutely,
Good job. Good job, EU. And we can't travel to Belarus now because of all the stupidity from the EU.
Absolutely.
Good job. Russell Hall says it's the Taiwan Relations Act that he's referring to.
Oh, I see. Okay. Right. Well, as I said, we haven't, I think, quite got to that point yet. But, who knows? Maybe we will.
Yeah. And the final super chat here is from Raphael, and it's a good one. On a lighter note, are you too excited about Russia making a movie in space? LOL. Can you guys have tickets for the grand premiere?
Well, I would certainly
add one more thing that Raphael says, a pretty actress as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, gosh. Well, definitely I'm excited, and we'll certainly watch this film.
Well, you enjoy Russian cinema. You are another topic that that's a hobby of yours, and you know quite a lot about is cinema and Russian cinema.
Absolutely. I mean, good. And of course, the Russians have done some great science fiction. I mean, Solaris by Tarkovsky is one of the great science fiction films. And that's, of course, in space.
Was that the remake that George Clooney did a remake, Solaris? That was referencing that film?
Exactly.
Okay.
But he's nowhere near as good as the original. I mean, the Russian original is many times better. No comparison. What many people don't know, by the way, is that the Russians even had a a rival to Star Trek in the 60s. Very wasn't particularly successful, but they've done things. Anyway, we'll see what this film is like, but it sounds exciting, and I will certainly watch it.
Yeah, right. We have a couple more super chats just came in from Flying Boar. Erdogan antagonizes Russia on Crimea. Pretty hypocritical for a guy who illegally occupied Cyprus. Well said, Flying Boar.
So true, so true. Absolutely.
Well said. Erdogan doesn't let the Crimea thing go. He pokes
think
Russia with that all the time.
I think he does that in the belief that gets him some kind of leverage over the Russians. All it actually does is annoy them. But he just won't let it go. And he did it again recently. And the Russians were very annoyed. This was in the run-up to a very important meeting between him and Putin in Sochi. So,
yeah. And Russell Hall says Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China in the sense that they dispute the PRC's claim over mainland China. They are not connected to the PRC.
Absolutely correct. I mean, the Republic of China was the name for China before the Communist Party gained power in 1949. And what happened was that the government of the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled Beijing, escaped to Taiwan, established itself there, but continued to insist that it was the legitimate government of China, thus the name the Republic of China. And at that time, in the 1950s, it was recognized by the United States as the legitimate government of China. And by the way, it occupied China's seat in the UN Security Council and continued to do so for 2 decades.
All right. That's everything, Alexander. Chris Banks says Soviet Trek didn't quite have the same ring to it.
No, I know.
and Mad Mike says Sputnik Wars instead of Star Wars.
Oh, well, there you go.
All right. We got all the questions. And from locals as well, a lot of good questions. And from the live stream, a lot of good questions. Thank you to everybody who listened to us for exactly 3 hours.
Well, there you go.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
3 hours.
Fantastic. And great live stream, if I could say.
Great live stream. And a big thank you to Cosmic Rain, to Reckless Abandon, to Valies, to Alan Watson. Did I miss anybody that was moderating? I don't think so. I think I got the moderators in there. Thank you very much to all the moderators. You guys ran a really good live stream. A lot of great questions, a lot of great comments. And we'll call it a wrap for today, Alexander. We covered a lot of ground. We started from Putin and we ended up at a Soviet Star Trek.
Yeah, we did. We absolutely did.
From an energy crisis to Soviet Star Trek. Real quick, Alexander, did you see the new James Bond? Are you going to see the new James Bond? Have you heard about the new James Bond?
I am absolutely going to see the new James Bond, but I haven't seen it yet. And I'm very much looking forward to it, and we'll see. I've had some good reviews, actually, but, I'm not going to judge it until I've actually seen it.
Right. Do you know the spoilers?
No, I don't.
I won't say the spoilers, but I'm just asking if you know them.
I deliberately avoid doing so.
Okay.
The one thing I will say is that I do think that Daniel Craig is getting a bit old for the role, and I think if we move on, the Daniel Craig who plays James Bond, I think he's getting a bit old for the role.
Who's your favorite Bond?
Oh, Sean Connery, beyond any question. I mean, I don't think anybody played him as well as Sean Connery did in the 60s. I think there's and the first couple of films, with him were just brilliant and set the scene. And of course, Ian Fleming, who was the creator of James Bond, who wrote the stories, was involved in making some of those films. And in fact, he adapted the character in the later novels based on Sean Connery's interpretation of the character. So there we are.
Chris says that you could be the new James Bond.
Oh well, I think that's rather unlikely, but there we go.
Yeah, you have the accent. Accent. Flying Boar wants to know an update on Saakashvili.
Oh, he's in prison, isn't he? He's been arrested, but it's
6 years, probably 6 years.
Probably 6 years. But the interesting thing was he came to Georgia. I think he was expecting a vast uprising, and it didn't happen. So nothing like that happened.
Why did he return, Ali? I have to ask you before I let you go. Why did he return back? I mean, is this hubris? Is this ego? Because it was just a flat out stupid move. Did he actually think that I'm going to return back and be hailed as a hero in my country? And
I think he did. I think it's exactly what he thought. I mean, there was rather a fraught situation in Georgia. There were local elections, and I think he thought that there would be a massive uprising, a great outpouring of the people onto the streets in support of Saakashvili. In fact, what I think his presence is going to do is unite a lot of people behind the present government, because with Saakashvili back in Georgia, many people will see him as a threat again, because he was to say that he was controversial in Georgia would be an understatement. I think a lot of Georgians would not want to see him back in any shape or form. So I think it's a big mistake, and I think he's got many years in prison in front of him.
You heard the news the other day about Saakashvili as well, his wife and his marriage. That his wife came out and said that when he was in Ukraine, he fell in love with a Ukrainian parliament minister, and now she's pissed off at him as well. So it looks like Saakashvili's in the not only in the big house, but in the doghouse as well. Well, and on that note, we'll end the live stream. Alexander, any final words before we cut out?
It's a great live stream, and we covered a huge amount of ground. We'll see what happens with the energy situation. I think this is going to be very interesting, actually, and it could turn very nasty in Europe, in which case a war of words is going to heat up between the Europeans and the Russians to an extraordinary degree, and we're going to see increasing numbers of European countries taking strong positions. I believe Orban, by the way, has come out and spoken very strongly. As we've been doing this program, it's been reported that he's been very critical of EU policy on energy, and we'll probably get more acrimony and quarrels in Europe about it.
And Raphael's final super chat that just came in. Let us have fun. Is Charles going to be king for a good 20 years when the Queen checks out? LOL.
I doubt it. Somehow. I mean, she's still there. And I would have thought that when she dies, they'll want to move on from Charles pretty quickly. I'm not suggesting anything, but already you can see that the focus is on his son, William, and that's probably the person most people who are in a position to decide these things would want to see take over.
All right. And Courtney says that Putin is James Bond.
Oh, well, there you go.
On that note, we will end it.
He was an agent, wasn't he? After all, I mean, he was part of an intelligence agency, so I suppose he's closer to.
He's pretty close to it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
All right. On that note, we'll end it there. We'll start with Putin. We'll end with Putin. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care, and look for our videos this weekend as well. We have some really good videos going up on the weekend. Duran.locals.com. And of course, Alexander, we've got Duran merchandise, 10% off.
Absolutely.
Use the code Real News. I think you have a hat over there, and you got your long sleeve.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Cold weather.
All right. Take care, everybody.